The night air over the Arabian desert is cold. A thin wind moves across the sand, tugging at the edges of a black tent. Inside, a single lantern burns, throwing shaky light over a man in a worn cloak. Outside, the stars hang like silent witnesses. A horse snorts. Somewhere far off, a wolf cries. The man bends over a rough map scratched into the dust. His finger traces a line between scattered oases, forgotten villages, and rival camps. He is not rich. He does not command a great army. Yet in his posture there is something unshakable, as if he already sees a kingdom that does not yet exist. His name is Abdulaziz ibn Saud. Beyond the tent flap, his followers sit in a circle, hands wrapped around steaming cups of bitter coffee. They whisper, argue, pray. Some think he is mad. Others think he is chosen. All of them know that before the sun rises again, men may die. In the distance lies Riyadh, a dusty town under another family's banner. Between this small band in the night and that town lie walls, rifles, and uncertainty, but also destiny. The torchlight flickers. Abdulaziz closes his hand into a fist over the map. In that moment, the story of a family that will rule a kingdom, hold the keys to the world's oil, guard the holiest cities of Islam, and shape global politics for a century, begins not with wealth, but with hunger, exile, and the cold taste of risk on the tongue. The desert is listening. History is about to shift its weight. Before we follow this journey through sand, oil, prayer, and power, you're welcome to walk with us. If this kind of storytelling moves you, consider staying, liking, and subscribing so we can keep traveling into the hidden rooms of history together. Sands of exile, the humble beginnings of a dynasty. The wind had a way of speaking in Najd. It blew low over the flat horizon, carrying dust, gossip, and the distant bark of rifles. On some days it smelled of dry earth and camel sweat. On others, it carried the faint scent of fear. Somewhere on that open plateau, a boy named Abdulaziz rode beside his father, the deposed Emir Abdul Rahman, nursing a bruise on his pride much deeper than the ache in his saddle-worn legs. The House of Saud had fallen. Riyadh, once their seat, now flew another banner. The Rashidis held the town, and with it, the symbol of power in central Arabia. The mud-brick walls that had echoed with his childhood footsteps now echoed with the boots of rivals. The family's loyal men were scattered. Some had bent the knee to the new rulers. Some had died. Others simply disappeared into the desert as if swallowed by the sand itself. Abdulaziz remembered the night they fled. The sound of hurried footsteps in the courtyard. The smell of panic, sharp and metallic, almost like blood. The rushed whisper of his mother gathering a few precious items, jewelry, a Quran, a folded piece of cloth carrying the emblem of their house. The door creaked open, and the stars stared down like indifferent witnesses as they mounted their animals in silence. Somewhere behind them, a dog began to howl. "Do not look back," his father said, his voice low but steady. But Abdulaziz did look back. He stole one last glance at the outline of Riyadh against the night sky, the faint torchlight on the walls, the city that had been their home and their claim. In that moment, exile had a taste, dust in his teeth, bitterness on his tongue. Now days later, as they rode across the desert toward Kuwait, the boy watched his father carefully. Abdul Rahman's face was burned by the sun and lined by years of war and tribal politics. To the tribes they passed, he was still an emir, a man of rank, a guest worthy of honor. But Abdulaziz could see something else in him, an invisible weight pressing on his shoulders, a silent question in his eyes. Had it all been for nothing? By night the men gathered around small fires. The flames licked at blackened coffee pots. Shadows danced on rough faces as they spoke in low voices, a mix of loyalty, worry, and calculation. "This is a test from God," one of the older men said, fingers wrapped around a steaming cup. "He raises and he lowers." Another, younger, restless, glanced toward the darkness. Or perhaps we were not strong enough. Abdul Rahman listened, saying little. But Abdulaziz, sitting just outside the circle, heard every word. Exile was not just a journey on the map, it was a slow burning in the heart. It was hearing your family's name spoken in the past tense. In Kuwait, the sea met the land with a different sound. Waves slapped against wooden dhows. The salty air stung the nostrils of a boy who had grown up with the dry breath of the desert. The market there was a swirl of languages: Arabic, Persian, Indian tongues, traders arguing over pearls, dates, textiles. For a time, the House of Saud lived in the shadow of foreign roofs, under the protection of the local ruler, Mubarak al-Sabah. They had shelter, but not sovereignty. In a modest house near the shore, days blurred. Women worked in tight courtyards. Men went out to seek favor, to maintain networks, to keep alive the idea that the Sauds were not finished, only waiting. Abdulaziz, now a teenager, walked the alleys with long strides, his height already impressive, his face sharp with focus. He listened. He listened to travelers arriving from Najd, asking them in careful tones, "What news from Riyadh? How many men does Ibn Rashid keep there now? Which tribes are loyal, which sit on the fence?" He noted every answer, storing it away like a map drawn in his mind. A family could lose its walls. It could lose its throne. But if it did not lose its memory, if it did not lose its will, then the story was not over. At night, in the quiet of the small room they shared, his father spoke to him in a voice softened by exhaustion, but hardened by experience. "You must never forget, my son," Abdul Rahman said, lying on his thin mattress, staring at the wooden beams above. "Power in these lands is not like the palaces you hear of in distant empires. It is not just marble and gold. It is men. It is alliances. It is faith. And it is patience." "Will we return?" Abdulaziz asked. There was a long pause. A cart rolled by outside, wheels crunching over sand. Somewhere a baby cried. The sea's breath whispered against the walls. "Inshallah," his father replied, "if God wills, and if you are strong enough to carry what I could not." For a moment the words hung in the air, heavy and alive. In that room, among the smell of sweat, sea air, and old wood, a quiet transfer took place, not of title or formal crown, but of expectation. A boy felt the weight of a misplaced kingdom settle onto his shoulders. Years passed in this state of in-between. Abdulaziz trained with the sword. He rode horses until his thighs burned. He practiced shooting until his shoulder ached from the recoil of old rifles. He studied not only the Quran, but also the patterns of men, the way tribal leaders shifted loyalty when pressure mounted, the way rivals could become allies if you touched their pride in the right way or their fear in the right place. In the majlis of Mubarak al-Sabah, he watched grown men negotiate. He saw how a pause could mean more than a speech, how silence could be a weapon, how a smile could hide a warning. Kuwait became, for him, not just a refuge but a school. There were moments of humiliation too. Moments when he, the son of a fallen emir, had to wait at doors, had to see his father bow slightly deeper than pride would prefer, had to accept that they lived at the edge of another ruler's goodwill. Those were the days that carved furrows inside him, hidden from view, where resolve settled like stone. One evening, as the sun sank red over the gulf and the call to prayer rose from the town's mosques, Abdulaziz stood alone near the shore. The tide lapped at the sand near his boots. His eyes were not on the water, but inland, toward the unseen heart of the peninsula. In his mind he could see the desert he had left behind, the thorny shrubs, the small wells, the scattered camps, Riyadh with its mud walls and narrow streets. He could almost hear the creak of the city's old gates, smell the sweat of its crowded souk. "We will go back," he whispered, as if speaking to the horizon itself. "Not as guests, not as beggars, as rulers." The wind did not answer, but somewhere deep within him, something settled into place, a line crossed, a decision made. Exile would not be the end of their story. It would be the ground from which their return was launched. What he did not yet know was how much blood the desert would ask in return. What he did not yet know was how much blood the desert would ask in return. The years in Kuwait hardened him. By the time he was in his early 20s, Abdulaziz was no longer just the boy who had fled Riyadh. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with sharp eyes that rarely missed a detail. Men listened when he spoke now. They saw in him not just youth but direction. Stories from Najd never stopped coming. Travelers sat cross-legged on woven mats in the Kuwaiti Majlis, setting down dust-covered saddlebags, and with them the latest rumors. The Rashidi grip on Central Arabia was strong but not perfect. Some tribes grumbled over taxes. Others disliked the Rashidi closeness with the Ottoman Empire. There were cracks, small but real. One night, after such a visitor had left, Abdulaziz turned to his father with unusual boldness. "Father," he said quietly, "we cannot stay like this. Waiting is killing us more slowly than any enemy." Abdul Rahman studied his son's face. The lamp on the wall flickered, casting shadows under his eyes. "You speak like a man who has already decided," the older man replied. "I have," Abdulaziz answered. "Riyadh is not a dream. It is the spine of our claim. If we take it, even with few men, our name rises. If we never try, we fade into stories." His father sighed, a long, tired sound. "Do you know what you are asking? You want to strike at a town held by a stronger house, backed by more men, more guns, and the favor of powerful friends. With what, my son? With hope?" "With faith," Abdulaziz replied. "With surprise, with the desert, and with those who still remember the Sauds with respect." The argument lasted deep into the night. Some of the family urged caution. Better to wait for a bigger chance, a safer plan, a clearer sign. But chance in the desert rarely came wrapped in comfort. It came like a storm, sudden, wild, demanding a decision. In the end, Abdul Rahman did not give full blessing, but he did not forbid it either. He saw that his son's resolve was a force in itself. "Go then," he said at last, his voice steady but his eyes wet. "Go with God. If you fall, fall with honor. If you return, return with more than words." With the quiet support of the Kuwaiti ruler, a small band was assembled. No grand army, just a few dozen men. Some were loyalists of the old days. Some were young fighters drawn to the fire in Abdulaziz's eyes. They packed what they could carry: rifles, ammunition, dates, water skins, blankets. There were no banners, no trumpets, no drums. Only the sound of saddles creaking and the low murmur of prayer as they prepared to ride into the unknown. Before dawn, on a cool, pale morning, Abdulaziz mounted his horse. He turned one last time toward the small house where his family watched from behind a wooden screen. His mother's hands gripped the edge of the opening so tightly her knuckles whitened. "Trust in God, my son," she whispered, though he could not hear her. He did not wave. He did not call out. He only set his jaw and pressed his heels into the horse's flanks. The small column moved off, their figures shrinking against the wide, empty land. The journey inland was a test of endurance as much as courage. Days under a burning sun, nights where the cold slipped under their cloaks like a knife. They avoided main wells, wary of spies, choosing smaller, hidden sources known only to a few. Sometimes they traveled by night, letting their horses pick their way in the starlight, the sky so bright with constellations it felt like riding under a dome of silver lanterns. Around the campfires, the men spoke in low voices. "Do you truly think we can take Riyadh with so few?" one asked as he watched sparks climb into the dark. Abdulaziz heard him but did not rebuke him. Doubt in such a mission was normal. Fear was honest. "We are not trying to break a fortress with numbers," he said. "We are trying to break their certainty. If we succeed, our enemies will remember that the Sauds are not ghosts. They are flesh. They are steel." When they drew close to the outskirts of Riyadh, the air seemed to thicken. This was not just any town. This was the seat of his childhood. The skyline was the same, yet different. The tall clay walls, the familiar shapes of towers, the palm groves on the edges, rustling softly in the breeze. They hid first in a small village nearby, then in a palm grove, moving carefully, watching the patterns of guards, traders, and travelers. As they observed, Abdulaziz refined his plan. The Masmak fortress at the heart of Riyadh would be the key. It housed the local Rashidi governor, Ibn Ajlan. Taking that fort would send a message louder than any letter. On the chosen night, the sky hung heavy, cloudless, cold. The date was early January 1902, though for the men waiting in the shadows, time was measured less by calendars and more by heartbeats. Abdulaziz divided his followers. A group would stay hidden outside the walls, guarding the retreat and waiting for his signal. He and a smaller band would slip into the town itself, using darkness and local support to move toward the fortress. As he adjusted the sword at his side and checked the rifle slung over his shoulder, one of the older men stepped up beside him. "If this fails," the man murmured, "you will not have the chance to try again." "If this fails," Abdulaziz replied, tightening his grip on the strap, "then we would have died slowly anyway. Better to let history remember where we fell." They slipped through a side entrance with the help of sympathizers inside the town. The streets were quiet, save for the mutter of distant voices and the soft bray of a donkey somewhere in the dark. Every sound felt sharper than usual. The creak of a door, the scrape of sandals, the murmur of a guard joking with another at the gate of the fortress. The Masmak loomed ahead, its thick walls rising from the earth, a familiar shape from his childhood now turned hostile. Lanterns flickered by the entrance. The gate was closed but not fully barred, a sign of confidence, maybe even laziness. The next moments would define far more than the fate of the men gathered there. Abdulaziz's heart pounded, not with fear alone but with a strange calm. All the years in exile, all the quiet humiliations, all the whispered vows by the sea and in small Kuwaiti rooms had led to this point, a narrow street, a closed gate, and a choice. He turned to his men, their faces pale in the lantern light, eyes wide, mouths set. "Remember," he said softly, "we are not just ourselves tonight. We carry the weight of our fathers, our mothers, and those who believed in us when we had nothing. Do not think of failure. Think of how our name will sound if we succeed." A final breath, a final prayer. Then they moved. What happened in the next few minutes would be told and retold in stories across Arabia. The sudden rush, the shout that broke the silent night, the struggle at the gate as they forced it open, the clash of steel in cramped space, the startled cries of guards dragged from sleep into chaos. A spear thrown with such force it lodged in the door beside Ibn Ajlan as he tried to retreat. The governor cut down in the confusion as Abdulaziz pushed forward, claiming the inner ground. Dust rose, men shouted Allahu Akbar. The echo of gunshots bounced off the clay walls, then slowly faded. As dawn crept over the horizon, the banner over the fortress had changed. The House of Saud was back in Riyadh. It was not a great empire. It was not yet a kingdom recognized by the world. It was a town, a fortress, a fragile claim defended by a few dozen loyal men and the force of will of one determined leader. But in the desert, small victories can be the seeds of vast futures. Word began to spread. In tents and villages, at wells and along caravan routes, people spoke in low, excited tones. "Have you heard? Ibn Saud has taken Riyadh." Some smiled in approval, others frowned in concern. The Rashidis would not sit quietly. The Ottomans would not ignore shifting sands. On the rooftop of the reclaimed fortress, as the morning sun turned the city walls golden, Abdulaziz looked out over the town where he had once played as a child. Below, people moved through the narrow streets, their faces turned upward, trying to see the new man on the old walls. Beside him, a loyal companion broke the silence. "You have done it," he said. "You have taken back what was lost." Abdulaziz did not answer at once. His eyes were on the horizon, where the desert stretched, hiding enemies and allies alike. "This is not the end," he said at last. "This is the beginning of the struggle, for now they know we are not finished, and they will come." The wind rose, brushing over the battlements, carrying with it the promise of battles, alliances, betrayals, and the slow, relentless building of something larger than one town. The House of Saud had stepped back onto the stage of history, but greater forces were already moving, forces of faith, empire, and ambition that would soon test not just their courage, but the very soul of the land they sought to rule. The wind over Riyadh that morning carried a different sound. It moved through the narrow streets and over the flat rooftops, lifting scraps of cloth, stirring the tops of palm trees, rattling loose shutters. But beneath its usual whisper there was something new, the hum of rumor. Old men in the mosque courtyard leaned toward each other to repeat it. Women drawing water at the well paused, the ropes creaking in their hands, to listen. Shopkeepers in the souk looked up from their scales and sacks of grain. The Sauds have returned. The words felt half forbidden, half remembered, like a prayer once whispered in better days. For some, it was a welcome sound. For others, it was a warning. But for everyone, it meant one thing. The balance of power had shifted, even if only slightly, and in a land of tribes and rivalries, any shift sent waves in every direction. Inside the Masmak fortress, the air was thick with the smell of sweat, dust, and victory not yet settled. The men who had stormed the walls hours earlier were now posted at doors and corners, their rifles close, their eyes sharp. Every sound outside, the clatter of hooves, the shout of a vendor, the distant bark of a dog, could be the beginning of a counterattack. Abdulaziz walked the corridors he had known as a boy, his boots striking the packed earth floors. The place felt smaller than he remembered, and yet heavier with meaning. A room where he had once watched elders discuss tribal disputes was now a command center for a fragile hold on power. A courtyard where he had run with other children now held nervous messengers and wide-eyed townsmen pledging loyalty, or pretending to. One of the townsmen, a middle-aged man with a trimmed beard and tired eyes, stood before him, hands slightly shaking. "We heard the gunfire," the man said. "This morning they said the Rashidi governor was dead. We did not believe it, but now," his gaze lifted to the banner above the fort, "what will you do now, Ibn Saud?" Abdulaziz studied him for a moment before answering. "Now," he said simply, "we hold. We prove that this is not a raid, it is a return." Holding, however, would not be easy. Scouts whispered of Rashidi forces rallying in the north. Messages had already been sent to their allies, calling for retribution. The Ottomans, watching from their posts in the wider Arabian lands, would take note of any disturbance that threatened their fragile hold. Riyadh was a prize, but a vulnerable one. In the following days, Abdulaziz moved with restless purpose. He met with local notables in dim rooms, sitting on worn cushions, coffee poured in the traditional 3 cups, hospitality, honor, farewell. He spoke of stability, of justice, of restoring order under his family's name. "Our enemies say we are finished," he told a small gathering one night, his voice steady, his hands open. "But you know our history. You know that we ruled here before. We are not strangers. We are of this soil. If you stand with us, we will protect your markets, your wells, your families. We will rule by law and by faith, not by fear alone." Some nodded, some hesitated. Loyalty in Najd was rarely simple. It was a tangled rope of memory, self-interest, fear, and hope. More than one man left such meetings thinking not about honor, but about which side would be standing a year from now. Abdulaziz understood this. He did not expect love from all. He expected calculation. So he gave them something to calculate with, a small but disciplined force, swift punishments for open betrayal, and visible respect for religious scholars whose words carried weight deeper than any sword. In one of the town's modest mosques, a group of ulama, religious scholars, sat in a semicircle after the evening prayer, their white turbans and plain cloaks lit by lantern glow. Their beards moved as they murmured to each other, discussing what had happened, what it meant, and what God's law demanded. When Abdulaziz entered, he did so without show. He greeted them with the proper phrases of peace, sat on the floor as they did, and lowered his head in humility. For all his ambition, he knew that in this society, power without religious legitimacy was like a tent without its poles. One of the older scholars, his voice thin but clear, spoke first. "We have seen your family rule before, Ibn Saud," he said. "We have seen your father, your grandfathers. We have also seen this town change hands in blood. Why should we believe that your rule will be different? Will you uphold God's law, or will you chase power as others do, using religion only as a cloak?" The question was not an insult, it was a test. Abdulaziz chose his words with care, his eyes fixed respectfully on the mat in front of him. "I am a man," he said. "I have ambitions, and I will not lie about that, but I know that without God's pleasure no house stands. Our family's history is tied to those who called for the purification of this land's faith. I do not promise perfection, I promise effort. I promise that I will judge by the Quran and the Prophet's example as best as I can. And I promise you this, if you see me stray, you must remind me. If you see me oppress, you must resist me." The room held a deep silence for a moment. The scholars exchanged glances. They knew the weight of what he was saying. Rulers often spoke of faith when they were weak and ignored it when they were strong. But here was a man just beginning, tying his authority openly to their judgment. It was both a sign of sincerity and a way to bind them to his success. "Very well," the elder said at last. "We will see your actions. If you uphold the law, we will support you in word and deed. If you do not, we will answer first to God, not to you." That fragile understanding, formed in a simple mosque under hanging lamps, was more than a local pact. It was a renewal of an older pattern carved into the history of the House of Saud, a joining of political authority and religious legitimacy that would define the kingdom to come, and draw admiration and criticism in equal measure. Outside, the desert did not pause for these decisions. It moved on, indifferent. Within weeks, the Rashidis tested his hold. A force moved toward Riyadh, hoping to crush this small rebellion before it could grow teeth. The desert once again became a chessboard of riders, scouts, and messengers. Abdulaziz rode out with his men, not always meeting the enemy in open battle but harassing, watching, using knowledge of the land as a shield. Sometimes the fights were small, sharp, and brutal, ambushes near wells, sudden clashes at dawn that ended as fast as they began. Each time they survived, each time they pushed back even slightly, his reputation grew. "He is bold," some said. "He is reckless," others muttered. "Maybe both," whispered those who watched from the sidelines, waiting to choose a side. Inside Riyadh, life settled into a tense rhythm. Markets reopened fully. Children ran again through the alleys. The call to prayer echoed from the mosques as it always had. On the surface, nothing had changed, but beneath, everything was different. People measured their words more carefully. They listened to caravans for news of Rashidi movement. They studied the face of their new ruler, trying to read what kind of man he truly was. In the evenings on the rooftop of the fortress, Abdulaziz would sometimes stand alone, looking over the town and out to the horizon. The lights of Riyadh were few, just small clusters of lanterns. Beyond them, only darkness. Yet in that darkness he saw outline after outline, tribes not yet subdued, regions not yet claimed, rival powers not yet confronted. One such evening, a close companion joined him, his cloak pulled tight against the rising night breeze. "You have done much in a short time," the man said. "From exile to this in just a few years. Do you ever fear that it could all vanish as quickly?" Abdulaziz did not answer immediately. He watched a distant lantern flicker and go out. "Fear is always there," he said finally. "But it is not the fear of losing walls or a title. It is the fear of losing the purpose behind them. If we rule only for ourselves, we will fall. If we rule in the name of order and faith, then even if we are broken, our idea will remain." His companion looked at him, hearing in those words the outline of something larger than a personal quest. an idea of a unified land, governed by a strict understanding of religion, tied to a single family's leadership. Some would call it justice, others would call it domination. Either way, it was a vision that would not stay small. The first foundations of Abdulaziz's future kingdom were not laid in marble or mapped in foreign capitals. They were laid in nights like this, in hard-won victories, in wary agreements with scholars, in conversations on rooftops where the air smelled of dust and distant cooking fires. In the huts, tents, and mud-brick homes of Najd, people began to adjust their prayers. Where they had once asked for simple safety from raids and famine, some now slipped in a new request under their breath. God, if this man is good for us, keep him strong. If he is not, remove him gently. Far beyond Riyadh, though, other eyes were turning toward Central Arabia. In Ottoman offices, reports were filed. Unrest, a local leader retaking a town, tribal movements. In Rashidi councils, anger sharpened plans for revenge. And in the memories of older scholars and tribal elders, the name Saud stirred ancient thoughts of an earlier time when a similar alliance of faith and sword had changed the map of the peninsula. The past was not finished speaking, the future was already listening. And as Abdulaziz stood on the walls of his reclaimed city, feeling the rough stone under his hands and the tug of the desert wind on his cloak, he did not yet know that his struggle to hold this one town was only the opening act of a much larger drama, one in which religion, war, and the dream of a united Arabia would become inseparable. The years that followed were a blur of dust, hoofbeats, and whispered oaths. Riyadh was the center of the wheel, but the spokes were still loose. Villages around the town watched carefully. Some sent delegations with cautious smiles, bringing dates, cloth, or camels as gifts, their real offering hidden in their words. A pledge of support, thin as paper, trembling over the deeper fear of choosing the wrong side. Others stayed silent, waiting to see whether the Rashidis would sweep down and make an example of this young upstart who had dared to reclaim his ancestral seat. Abdulaziz did not have the luxury of waiting. He understood that a ruler in Arabia could not sit still. If he did, the desert would move around him, and he would wake up one day to find himself encircled by enemies and forgotten by friends. So he rode. He rode to nearby settlements that remembered the Sauds with warmth, reminding them of old protection and promising new stability. He sat in smoky tents, his cloak dusty from travel, listening to tribal leaders list their grievances against the Rashidis, unpaid promises, heavy levies, raids unchecked. He did not interrupt. He let them speak until their anger burned clean. When the Sauds ruled, one old sheikh said, his voice trembling with age, we knew where we stood. We knew the law. We knew who to go to when wronged. With the Rashidis, everything is confused. Then let us remove confusion, Abdulaziz replied, leaning forward, his hands open. Stand with me, not only with words but with actions. If you do, your lands will be under a rule that fears God before fearing men. Some pledged at once. Others hedged, giving him men for a limited campaign, testing the strength of his leadership like a rider testing a horse before buying it. With each small alliance, his reach grew. With each refusal, he marked a name in his mind, a tribe to be approached later with either gift or steel. Battles, when they came, were often small in number but large in meaning. Skirmishes near wells where a handful of men fell, and the survivors carried stories back to their people. Night raids on Rashidi loyalists who woke to the crack of gunfire and the thunder of hooves. For every engagement won, Abdulaziz's image swelled. The exiled prince who had returned, the man who rode at the front, who ate the same coarse food as his men, who laughed with them by the fire and knelt beside them in prayer. But power is never only built in the open field. Inside Riyadh, another kind of work took place. Disputes between townspeople came to him now, merchants arguing over weights and debts, families fighting over inheritance, a man accusing another of theft. Abdulaziz made a point of listening to each side, calling witnesses, consulting scholars and giving verdicts that were firm but grounded in religious law. Sometimes his decisions made him enemies. A powerful man might leave muttering, offended by a ruling that did not favor him. Yet as weeks turned into months, a pattern formed. People began to say, "Take it to Ibn Saud, he will judge." A ruler in Arabia, he knew, must be more than a warrior. He must be a judge, a mediator, a symbol of order in a land where chaos was never far away. One afternoon, as the sun dropped toward the jagged line of roofs, a badly injured man was carried through the streets and laid at the gate of the fortress. His clothes were torn and stained dark. Blood had dried in stiff patches on his arms. His eyes fluttered under heavy lids. "Bandits," someone said breathlessly. "On the road north, they attacked a caravan, took everything." Abdulaziz came down himself to see the wounded man. He knelt beside him, the hem of his cloak brushing the dusty ground. "Who attacked?" he asked softly. The man's voice was barely more than air. They claimed no loyalty, took from us from people of Riyadh, said there was no law now, only whoever has the gun." Something hard flickered in Abdulaziz's gaze. "Then we will remind them there is law," he said. Within hours, a small force rode out. They tracked the bandits across the open land, following signs invisible to untrained eyes. A broken twig, a disturbed patch of sand, the faint smell of smoke from a distant camp. When they finally found them, huddled around stolen goods and laughing at their good fortune, the bandits did not laugh for long. That night, the bodies of those who had refused surrender hung as a warning near the town's edge. Harsh, some whispered. Necessary, others said. But everyone understood the message. Under this man, the space between right and wrong would not be left to the strongest arm alone. Yet for all his efforts to build justice and alliances, the deeper structure he needed was still incomplete. He had reclaimed a town and gathered men, but he had not yet fully reawakened the older force that had once made the House of Saud different from other tribal rulers. That force lived not in walls or markets, but in hearts, a shared, strict vision of faith. On a cool evening, sitting on a rug spread over the packed earth of the fortress courtyard, Abdulaziz spoke with an elder who had known earlier generations. "You remember the days of Diriyah," Abdulaziz said, pouring the man a cup of coffee. "You remember how my ancestors ruled then. What made their rule spread so far? It was not only the sword." The old man's eyes, half clouded with age, brightened with memory. "No," he said slowly. "It was more than that. It was the call to cleanse the faith, to bring people back to the pure worship of God. People feared them, yes, but they also believed that following them meant following the right path. That is a powerful thing, my son. A ruler can lose a battle and still be followed if people think he carries truth. Without that, he is only another chief, one raid away from losing everything." The words settled over the courtyard like falling dust. In the days that followed, Abdulaziz found his thoughts returning again and again to that older story. The first Saudi state, born from a pact between his ancestors and the preacher Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab. That alliance had once turned scattered tribes into a movement, had sent armies riding out with Qurans in their saddlebags and conviction in their hearts. If he wanted to build not just a local rule but a true dominion, he would need a similar spine of belief running through his cause. One night he unrolled a worn map in a dimly lit room. His finger traced not just the roads and wells but places of memory, towns where scholars had once taught, villages where the Wahhabi call had first taken root. He thought of their descendants, of their ideas still murmured in some circles, feared in others, but alive. "What use is a sword," he murmured to himself, "if it does not serve an idea greater than its owner?" Outside, the wind shifted, slipping through the cracks in the old walls, carrying with it the scent of distant fires and the faint murmur of life in the town below. Somewhere, a child laughed. Somewhere else, a man coughed in his sleep. The world went on, unaware that a decision was forming in the mind of the man who now ruled Riyadh. 2. The north, the Rashidis sharpened their knives. To the west, the holy cities waited under other flags. To the east, the Gulf shimmered, where foreign empires watched the peninsula with patient interest. At the center of it all, a ruler who had clawed his way back from exile now understood that holding a fortress and a town was not enough. He would need something stronger to bind the land to him, something that flowed not only through fear or loyalty, but through belief. Soon, he would seek out those who carried that legacy. Soon, words spoken in quiet rooms about the purity of worship and the danger of innovation would join with rifles and riders, forming a new pattern across the desert. And when faith and the sword met again in the hands of the House of Saud, the shape of Arabia itself would begin to change. Faith and the sword, the pact that forged a kingdom. In another time, long before Abdulaziz was born, another man walked the dusty streets of a small town called Diriyah. The year was the mid-1700s. The sun fell on crumbling walls and narrow alleys where children chased each other, kicking up clouds of fine beige powder. In that town lived a local emir from the same bloodline as Abdulaziz, Mohammed ibn Saud, and a preacher whose words had begun to stir both admiration and fear across the central plateau, Mohammed ibn Abd al-Wahhab. On some evenings, villagers would gather outside a small house, feeling the heat of the day still rising from the ground under their feet, and listen as the preacher spoke of returning to pure worship. No saints, no tombs, no charms, only God. His voice was clear, unshaking. Victory does not come from numbers, he would say. It comes from obedience. If we cleanse our belief, God will cleanse our land of injustice. His message was simple but sharp. It cut old habits at the root. Some loved him, some wanted him silenced. But one man in particular saw something else in these words, not only piety but power. In a shaded hall, Mohammed ibn Saud and Mohammed ibn Abd al-Wahhab sat facing each other on woven rugs. Between them, cups of coffee steamed. Around them, the room held its breath. The preacher spoke of faith. The emir spoke of rule. Out of that conversation came a pact. The sword and the sermon would walk together. One would spread the call, the other would protect it, and together they would build something more lasting than a single tribal chief's glory. That first Saudi state would one day be crushed, its capital bombarded by Ottoman cannons, its leaders executed or driven into exile. But the idea that rulers from the House of Saud would stand as guardians of a strict, reforming faith did not die with the ruins of Diriyah. It slipped like a thread through time, waiting to be picked up again. Now in the early 1900s, Abdulaziz stood in that same lineage, staring at the same desert, facing old questions in a new age. He had retaken Riyadh. He had proven his courage. But courage alone could not turn scattered towns into a real dominion. He needed something that would give his rule not just force, but meaning. He needed hearts as much as he needed rifles. So he began to seek out the heirs of that older religious movement, the scholars and families whose grandparents and great-grandparents had once walked beside his own in the days of Diriyah. In a modest house not far from Riyadh's mosques, he sat with one such man, a descendant of the old preaching family. The room smelled of ink and old paper. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with handwritten books, their pages darkened from years of use. The scholar's beard was white, his eyes sharp behind the fine lines of age. He listened as Abdulaziz spoke, hands resting on his knees. "Our land is broken," Abdulaziz said. "Tribes fight over little things. Foreign influence creeps in from all sides. The Rashidis rule some of our people with fear alone. I want to unite this region, not only under my name but under God's law, as our ancestors once did." The scholar tilted his head, considering him. "Many men have said such words," he replied quietly. "They speak of God when they are weak and forget him when they are strong. Why should we believe you will be different?" Abdulaziz did not rush his answer. He knew this was not a battlefield where speed alone won. This was a different kind of combat, one of patience, sincerity, and memory. "I'm not asking you to trust my heart," he said finally. "Only God can judge that. I'm asking you to judge my actions. Walk with me, advise me, correct me when I drift. Help me build courts that judge by the Quran and the Sunnah, not by personal whim. Help me raise people who see this rule not as a family's ambition, but as a means to protect the faith and secure justice." The scholar watched him for a long moment, seeing not just the young ruler in front of him, but the shadow of an older alliance stretching back more than a century. "You are asking," he said slowly, "for what our forefathers once gave. Our tongues, our teachings, and our approval, in exchange for your promise to give victory to God's law." "Yes," Abdulaziz answered. "Remember," the scholar said, his voice gaining quiet force, "if we stand with you, we will call people not just to obey you, but to obey God. If you betray that, your fall will be worse than your rise." Abdulaziz bowed his head. "Then let me never forget that warning." From that house and others like it, a new layer began to form over his rule. Preachers loyal to the strict creed of Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab traveled with his forces. They taught in mosques and village courtyards, speaking of pure worship, of the evil of practices they saw as corruptions, visiting shrines, praying to the dead, seeking blessings from objects instead of from God alone. They also spoke of obedience to the imam, the ruler who upheld this vision. At first, it seemed like only words about faith in a land where people had heard many preachers before. But slowly, those words began to shape something more solid. In the wide, empty stretches beyond the settled towns, Bedouin tribes wandered with their flocks, following the rain and the grass. Their lives were hard and simple. Loyalty flowed with the seasons. One year they might raid in one direction, the next year in another if the price was right. But now, preachers and envoys from Ibn Saud began to visit their camps with a new message. In a windswept encampment, where tents of black goat hair flapped against the sky, a group of young Bedouin men sat in a circle, listening to a scholar with a strong, clear voice. "Your strength," he told them, "is from God. Your spears, your rifles, your courage, all of it is a trust. Are you content to spend it on small raids against your neighbors? Or will you join in a greater struggle to bring this whole land under a single banner of true religion?" One of the young men frowned, fiddling with the fringe of his cloak. "What difference does it make?" he asked. "A raid is a raid, a fight is a fight. We have always done this." The scholar leaned forward. "It makes all the difference," he said. "When you fight for your tribe alone, your reward ends with your tribe. When you fight to clear this land of shirk and corruption, when you obey a ruler who applies God's law, your reward is with God Himself." Those words, and many like them, began to sink into hearts that were used to following the strongest voice in the tent. Slowly, groups of Bedouin began to settle in special communities encouraged by Ibn Saud, places where they would be taught this stricter form of Islam, trained as disciplined fighters, and tied more tightly to his leadership. They would one day be known by a name that carried both fear and respect, the Ikhwan, the brothers. But at this early stage, they were just men forming a new kind of loyalty, somewhere between tribe and army, driven by sermons as much as by pay. In Riyadh, as news of growing numbers reached him, Abdulaziz walked through the courtyard of his fortress, listening to the echoes of recitation from the nearby mosque. The voices of students learning verses of the Quran drifted over the walls like a steady, rhythmic tide. One of his close advisors walked beside him. "You have always had men ready to fight," the advisor said. "But now something is changing. They speak not only of your bravery but of the cause. They say they fight so that the call of pure worship spreads and the land is ruled by God's law." Abdulaziz nodded, though his eyes remained thoughtful. "That is good," he said. A man who fights only for me will leave when I am weak. A man who fights for God and believes I serve that cause may stay, even when things look dark. But, the advisor added carefully, men who believe they fight for God can also be hard to control. Abdulaziz stopped walking. The shouts of boys at play floated up from a nearby alley. A donkey brayed somewhere beyond the walls. The air smelled of dust and cooking bread. "That is true," he said quietly, "which is why the line must be clear. They follow the scholars in matters of faith, and they follow me in matters of war and rule. If that line blurs, the sword we wield together can one day turn in our own hands." He spoke the words almost as a warning to himself. Beyond Najd, the world was changing as well. Telegraph wires hummed in distant provinces of the Ottoman Empire. European ships moved along the coasts of the Gulf, their flags flapping over steel hulls. Ideas about nation-states, parliaments, and revolutions fluttered like unfamiliar birds at the edges of the Arabian world. But in the heart of the desert, the engine of change was older and simpler, a fusion of faith and force. As tribes slowly shifted their loyalty, as mosques began to echo with the same teachings across wider stretches of land, as the name Ibn Saud became linked in many minds not just with a man, but with a mission, the foundation stones of a new state were being laid, not in marble halls, but in tents and villages, on prayer mats and saddles. And somewhere out there, in a growing settlement of newly pious warriors, a young equine fighter tightened the strap of his rifle, listening to his teacher say, "Soon you will ride, not just for your clan, for all of this." The desert waited, holding its breath. The desert waited, holding its breath. In the northern reaches of Najd, dawn bled slowly across the sky, turning the sand from cold blue to pale gold. In that growing light, shadows shifted around the tents of an equine settlement, a community unlike the wandering Bedouin camps of the past. Here the men woke at the first call to prayer, rising from thin mats as the air still held the night's chill. Their rifles leaned neatly against tent poles. Their horses, tethered in straight rows, snorted into the morning wind. Fires were lit, not for idle storytelling but for boiling water to make the simplest coffee. Laughter and casual chatter, the music of tribal life, were muted. Everywhere discipline and purpose. In one tent, a young man named Faisal sat cross-legged before an older scholar. The flickering lantern cast long shadows over the open books spread out between them. The inked script curled like vines across the pages. "You must understand," the scholar said, tapping the text with a slender finger. "The Prophet's companions did not divide their lives into worship and war. They lived their faith at every moment in their prayers, their judgments, their battles. You too must be ready to do the same." Faisal nodded, his eyes filled with the fierce light of youth. "Teacher," he whispered, "when will we be called to ride for the Imam? When will Ibn Saud summon us?" "Soon," the scholar replied. "And when he does, remember, your loyalty is not to him alone. It is to God and to the law of God that he promises to uphold." Outside, a horn sounded, a deep, resonant note that rolled across the sand like thunder. The settlement stirred. Men rose to saddle their horses, their movements quick and practiced. Dust swirled beneath their boots. A call had come from Riyadh. Not for war, not yet, but for gathering, for allegiance, for the tightening of a bond that would shape the future of Arabia itself. The gathering in Riyadh. The roads leading into Riyadh filled with riders over the next several days. Their camels moved in single-file lines. Their horses snorted clouds of dust. Their banners fluttered behind them, plain cloth marked with verses rather than tribal emblems. Townspeople watched from rooftops as this new kind of force approached. Some felt pride, others felt dread, many felt both. Inside the Masmak fortress, Abdulaziz stood at the window slit of the upper tower, watching the procession wind toward the city. His arms were crossed over his chest, his face impassive, but inwardly he measured every detail. The number of riders, the discipline of their lines, the earnestness in their faces. This was not a hired army. This was a movement. His advisor, Abdullah bin Jalawi, a fierce warrior who had helped retake Riyadh, stepped beside him. "They are strong," Abdullah said, "stronger than any force we have had before." "And devoted," Abdulaziz added quietly. "Devotion can build nations, but it can also burn them." Abdullah glanced at him. "You fear they may one day ask for more than we can give." "I fear," Abdulaziz replied, "that if their understanding of God's law differs from ours, they may believe they serve God by disobeying their ruler." Abdullah grunted, "Then guide them." "Yes," Abdulaziz said softly, "guide them." Below, the first wave of Ikhwan entered the city, dismounting in orderly ranks. Their chants rose into the air, not of tribal honor but of unity and faith. "God is our witness, God is our strength." Their voices rolled like a river through Riyadh's narrow streets. Inside the meeting hall. In the large hall of the fortress, its walls decorated with patterned carpets, its ceiling darkened by the smoke of countless lamps, Abdulaziz sat cross-legged at the head of the gathering. Around him, scholars in white turbans and plain cloaks sat on his right. On his left, tribal sheiks with heavy cloaks and proud bearing. Before him, row after row of Ikhwan fighters filled the hall, their faces flushed from travel, their eyes bright with fervor. A hush rippled across the room. Abdulaziz raised his hand, and when he spoke, his voice carried without effort. "Brothers," he began, "this land has suffered for many years. Divided tribes, unjust rulers, weak law, foreign influence creeping like vines through our fields. We have taken back our capital. We have rebuilt our name, but this is not enough." He paused, letting the silence deepen. "The Prophet, peace be upon him, said, 'He among you who sees a wrong should change it with his hand, and if he cannot, then with his tongue.'" A murmur of approval passed through the room. "We mew. Since change the wrongs of this land," Abdulaziz continued. "We must bring unity where there has been division, justice where there has been oppression, faith where there has been corruption. But hear me, and hear me well, we must do this with wisdom, with patience, and with obedience to God's law as taught by our scholars." He gestured toward the ulama seated to his right. "These men will guide us in matters of faith. They have studied what most of us have not. Obey them, honor them. Do not take the law into your own hands." His gaze swept across the room. "And when it comes to war, to alliances, to the decisions that shape the fate of tribes and towns, you obey me. Not because I am perfect, not because I am always right, but because God commands that there be a leader to prevent chaos." A young Ikhwan warrior leaned to his neighbor, whispering, "He speaks like the old leaders of Diriyah." Another whispered back, "He speaks like a man chosen." Abdulaziz raised his voice again. "We will restore this land inch by inch, not for my glory but for God's. And if I stray, the scholars will remind me. If any of you stray, I will remind you." He paused, then delivered the line that would echo in Najd for generations. "We are brothers in faith, but in rule there must be order. Faith without order becomes rebellion. Order without faith becomes tyranny. We will walk between them." A wave of emotion moved through the hall. Men bowed their heads. Others raised their hands in silent prayer. The pact was no longer memory. It was alive again here in Riyadh. The first campaigns. Months later, the unified force set out from Riyadh, a long column of riders stretching across the plain like a dark ribbon. They rode toward the towns and tribes that had long stood under Rashidi influence or Ottoman oversight, places where judges were appointed by distant governors, where shrines had grown up around tombs, where tribal allegiances shifted like dunes in the wind. The Ikhwan rode with a fire in their hearts, believing they were restoring the land to a purer path. Their raids were swift, often overwhelming. Villages that resisted found their idols burned, their shrines torn down, their leaders summoned to swear loyalty. Villages that cooperated found protection, judges, and the promise of a new order. Abdulaziz rode with them on many campaigns, not always in battle but always in presence. He listened to tribal elders, corrected excesses, calmed disputes between zealous fighters and local townsmen. In one captured town, he instructed a trembling shopkeeper. "You will not be punished for the past," he said, "only for what you do now. Worship God alone, obey the law, pay your dues, and you will have peace." But in the back of his mind, he carried a concern that grew with every victory. The Ikhwan were loyal now, but they were also growing powerful. Some spoke openly. "We obey the Imam because he serves God's law. If he ever strays, we will correct him with our swords if we must." Abdulaziz heard these words but did not show fear. Instead, he made sure scholars taught continuously, reminding the Ikhwan that rebellion, even in the name of religion, was a fire that burned nations to ash. Still, he could feel it. A force too useful to be dismissed. Too dangerous to fully trust. A letter from the north. One evening, as the last light bled from the sky, a messenger arrived in Riyadh carrying a letter sealed with red wax, the mark of the Rashidi rulers in Hyle. Abdulaziz broke the seal and read the words by lamplight. "We know what you are doing," the letter said. "We know of your alliance with scholars and of your spreading influence. You claim to restore faith, but you bring rebellion. Stop before greater blood is spilled. The Ottoman Empire watches, and they will not tolerate your rise." Abdulaziz read the letter twice, then folded it carefully. "Prepare a reply," he told his scribe. "Tell them, it is not rebellion to restore what was taken from us, and it is not rebellion to judge by the law of God. If you call this rebellion, then judge me by the one who sees all." He rose, walked to the window, and looked out at the dark city, its lamps flickering like stars fallen to earth. "War is coming," he murmured. Not the small skirmishes they had fought so far. Not the local revolts. Something larger. Something decisive. Something that would test not only faith and courage, but the very balance between the sword and the sermon. Behind him, in the dim room heavy with silence, the flame of the lamp trembled, as if echoing the tension that was beginning to grip the entire desert. The storm was gathering. War did come. It did not arrive like a sudden storm that tears down tents in a single night. It came the way the desert changes a dune, a blow of wind here, a grain of sand there, each small shift almost invisible, until one morning a rider crests a ridge and finds the landscape completely changed. The struggle between the House of Saud and the House of Rashid grew in waves. There were seasons of raids, when mounted men would streak across the plains under a burning sun, rifles slung, cloth wrapped around their faces, leaving only their eyes visible. They struck at outposts, caravans, and loyal tribes, striking fast and vanishing before a larger response could arrive. At night, campfires burned low as men whispered over dates and coffee, plotting the next move. Then there were quieter years, when both sides licked their wounds, rebuilt alliances, and sharpened their tools. Rumors of Ottoman disinterest began to drift southward. The empire was weakening, its gaze turned to troubles closer to its center. In the spaces where its hand loosened, local powers moved. Abdulaziz understood this shift better than most. He could feel the great, invisible weight of the Ottomans lifting from Arabia's spine. Their banners still flew in some coastal towns. Their officials still issued orders on paper, but their willingness to fight over every corner of the desert was fading. "Our time is not only what we make," he told one of his advisors during a quiet evening in Riyadh. "It is also what others waste. While they grow weaker, we must become stronger." Strength for him did not mean only more men. It meant more belief. As the years passed, the Ikhwan became the sharp edge of his campaigns. Their numbers grew. Their discipline hardened. They rode under a shared cry that echoed over the dunes. One God, one leader, one law. To their supporters, they were heroic, simple men transformed into instruments of unity and purity. To their enemies, they were terrifying, fighters who saw compromise as weakness, who believed that defeat in battle might still mean victory in the sight of God, and who were unafraid to push their strict vision onto those who resisted. In one northern village, as the sun rose over flat roofs and low stone walls, the people woke to find equine riders lining the streets. Their faces were stern. Their horses' hooves stirred thin spirals of dust. A local elder stepped forward, swallowing down his fear. "Why have you come?" he asked. Their leader replied with a calm voice. "To invite you," he said, "to true worship and to obedience under a just imam. Tear down your shrines. Stop calling upon the dead. Follow the Quran and Sunnah. Pay allegiance to Ibn Saud. If you accept, you will be safe. If you refuse—" He let the sentence trail off. The unsaid hung in the air like a blade. Many accepted, some out of conviction, many out of fear. Back in Riyadh, reports of each town's reaction reached Abdulaziz. He listened carefully, praised restraint, and rebuked any excesses that threatened his larger goals. "Do not turn the people against us by harshness where mercy is allowed," he told his commanders. "But do not be weak where God's law is clear." In the north, the Rashidis watched this growing machine with tightening jaws. Their ruler in Hyle paced the floors of his fortress, listening to scouts describing equine forces who rode not for plunder but for creed. "This is not like the old tribal wars," one of his advisors warned. "These men believe. Men who believe are harder to break." "So do we," the Rashidi ruler snapped back. "And we have Ottoman guns, we have strong walls, let them come." They did. In a series of confrontations that stretched across years, the forces of Ibn Saud and the Rashidis met again and again. Some battles ended in stalemate, others in small victories, but slowly the balance of power tilted. The desert seemed to tilt with it, as tribes sensed which way the wind was beginning to blow. In one decisive campaign, as the heat of summer pressed down like a physical weight, Abdulaziz's forces closed in on the Rashidi stronghold of Hyle itself. The city, ringed by rocky hills, had long been a symbol of Rashidi strength. Its walls had seen sieges before. Its people were used to tension. Inside his tent, pitched on a rise from which he could see the hills and the distant shape of the town, Abdulaziz bent over a rough map. The lamplight flickered over his face, deepening the shadows under his eyes. Abdullah bin Jalawi entered, dust still clinging to his cloak. "Our men are ready," Abdullah said. "The equine are eager. Some say this is the day the truth will be decided between us and the Rashidis." Abdulaziz straightened, resting his hand on the hilt of his sword. "No," he said softly. "Truth is decided by God, not by one battle, but history remembers moments like this. We must be careful and firm." He stepped outside, and the night air hit his face like a cool cloth. Above, the stars wheeled in their endless patterns, indifferent to the men who killed and died beneath them. He walked through the camp, passing rough tents where men whispered prayers, where verses were recited, where some fighters sharpened blades while imagining the fight to come. As he moved, men rose, touching their chests in respect. He stopped near the edge of the camp, where the land dipped and rose toward Hyle. "If we take this town," he thought, "a rival house will fall, our path to the north will open, the story of this land will change." The siege that followed was not clean or quick. It dragged, grinding down nerves as much as supplies. Skirmishes flared at the edges. The sound of gunfire cracked against the stone hills. Inside the town, food grew scarce. Outside, the sun punished the besiegers with daily ferocity. Through it all, sermons and letters moved along the same paths as bullets and whispers. Scholars sent rulings justifying persistence. Rashidi supporters sent messages pleading for help that never came. The Ottomans, weakened and distracted, offered sympathy but little else. Finally, the defenses of Hyle broke. The Rashidi power bent under pressure it could no longer bear. The banner over their fortress was lowered. In its place, the mark of Ibn Saud rose. When Abdulaziz entered the town, he did so with controlled solemnity. There was no reckless pillage, no wild celebration allowed in the streets. He knew that a new ruler who begins with chaos plants seeds of rebellion. In the courtyard of the Rashidi fortress, he stood where his rival had once stood, feeling the echo of another man's ambitions under his feet. So, one weary townsman whispered to another, watching from a shadowed doorway, "This is the new master of Najd." "Not just Najd," the second replied quietly. "Look at the way the desert moves. He will not stop here." He did not. Hyle's fall was a turning point, not an ending. It sent a signal across Arabia. The House of Rashid, once the main counterweight to the Sauds, had been broken. The religious political engine built by Abdulaziz and the scholars around him had proven itself in the harshest test of all, war. From there, the road toward the holy cities of the Hijaz, Mecca and Medina, lay open in a way it had not been before. Those cities, under the Sharif of Mecca and watched closely by outside powers, represented something more than territory. They were the heart of Islam's most sacred geography. To bring them under his rule would mean more than expanding a kingdom. It would mean stepping into a new role, not just as ruler of a desert land, but as guardian of the holiest places in the Muslim world. It was an opportunity wrapped in danger. In Riyadh, as plans began to turn in the minds of his closest advisors, Abdulaziz once again found himself caught in the balance between faith and force, between the promise of greatness and the risk of overreach. He had revived an old pact and used it to bend the desert toward unity. But now, as his gaze shifted toward Mecca's minarets, still distant, still under another banner, he knew that every step he took next would echo far beyond the sands of Arabia. The world's eyes, which had barely glanced at his rise so far, would soon begin to look his way. And from beneath the ground of Najd, something else, something dark and thick, and yet unknown in its full power, waited quietly, ready to change not only his kingdom, but the fate of nations who had never even heard his name. Black gold and cold deals, oil America, and the price of power. Before the first drill bit ever touched Arabian soil, the land itself carried an old kind of poverty. In the 1920s and early 1930s, even as Abdulaziz's banners flew over more and more of the peninsula, his treasury was a thin, trembling thing. His kingdom had grown faster than its income. The unification of Najd and Hijaz had brought the holy cities under his control, but with them came responsibility. More mouths to feed, more roads to patrol, more judges to pay, more pilgrims to protect. In Riyadh, the royal court was no palace of gold. It was a cluster of mud brick buildings, sun-baked and cracked, their courtyards shaded with palm fronds and worn cloth. On some mornings, when the heat had not yet settled heavily over the city, Abdulaziz would sit with his closest advisors, beads slipping through his fingers, listening to the latest accounts. "Your Majesty," one of his treasurers would say, his voice tight, "the revenues from the pilgrimage this year were lower than expected. Political turmoil in other lands has kept some pilgrims away. We are behind in payments to certain tribes. Some stipends have gone unpaid." Another would clear his throat. "There are requests for weapons, requests for grain, requests for repairs to the Hijaz railway. Our hand is being pulled in every direction, but our purse is being pulled in only one." Abdulaziz would listen in silence, his broad frame steady, his eyes distant. He had won his kingdom with the currency of courage and faith, but to hold it, to build it, another currency was needed, one he did not yet have enough of. Outside, the streets of Riyadh were still simple. Donkeys pulled carts laden with dates. Men sat in front of their shops, selling cloth, spices, and tools. Children wove between them, barefoot, their laughter rising above the rumble of daily life. There was no hint yet, in the dry breeze or the smell of dust and sweat, of the wealth slumbering beneath the kingdom's soil. But beyond the horizon, other men, in suits and polished shoes, were already thinking about what lay hidden under Arabia's rocks. Whispers of oil. On the shores of the Gulf, the air was different from Riyadh. It was heavier, salted, and carried the cries of seabirds. In the small coastal town of Al-Khobar, wooden dhows bobbed on the water, their sails furled, their hulls creaking softly. Pearling, fishing, small-scale trade, these were the lifeblood of the area. Then strangers began to arrive. They did not move like desert men. They walked with the slight awkwardness of people unused to sand. They spoke in a harsh, clipped language that few locals understood. They carried strange instruments, survey tools, maps with many markings, and metal cases that clicked when opened. They were geologists and engineers, mostly from the United States. In a shaded tent near the coast, Abdulaziz sat across from a small delegation of Western visitors. The air inside was cooler than outside, but still thick with heat. An aide translated between English and Arabic, the words flowing slowly back and forth like careful traders at a market stall. One of the Americans, sweat beading at his temples, leaned forward slightly. "Your Majesty," he said through the interpreter, "we believe there may be oil beneath your lands, black gold. If you grant us the right to explore and drill, we will pay you. We will bring equipment. We will take the risk." The translator's Arabic carried the same message, though in softer cadences. "Oil," the interpreter said, using the new word that had only recently begun to move through local tongues. "A substance that burns easily, that can be sold to power engines, ships, and machines." Abdulaziz listened, his hands resting on his knees. He had heard of oil in nearby lands in Bahrain, in Persia. He knew it was valuable. He also knew his kingdom needed a new source of strength. "What guarantees do we have?" he asked, his deep voice calm. "What share would be ours, and what do you gain?" The American smiled slightly, a trained diplomatic smile. "We gain access to the oil," he replied. "We can refine it, sell it abroad. You gain money, jobs, technology. We gain profit. You gain independence from relying only on pilgrimage and small trade." Independence. The word settled in the room like a weight. For years, Abdulaziz had balanced his finances with support from the British, subsidies and agreements that helped him keep his forces paid and his borders stable. He was no puppet, but he was no fool either. He knew how quickly foreign promises could change with the tides of their own politics. Oil, if it truly existed in large amounts under his soil, could change that balance forever. But to reach it, he would have to invite outsiders deeper into his land. The concession. After long negotiations, cautious questions, and much prayer, a deal was struck in 1933 with an American company, Standard Oil of California, which would later form the core of Aramco. The agreement gave the Americans the right to explore for oil in a large portion of the eastern province in exchange for payments and a share of future profits. The signing was not a grand ceremony in a marble hall. It was inked in modest surroundings, on ordinary paper, with pens that scratched their way across letters, loops, and seals. But when the last mark was made, something immense shifted. Far from Riyadh, in offices in San Francisco and New York, men in suits studied maps and grinned over projected figures. "If we're right," one said, tapping a spot on the coastline, "this could be one of the biggest fields in the world." Back in Saudi land, local workers watched as tall metal structures began to rise out of the barren earth near a place called Dammam. The rigs towered against the sky like skeletal giants, their arms and wheels moving with metallic groans and rhythmic clanks. The desert, long ruled by the sound of wind, hooves, and human voices, now heard a new sound, machines chewing into the earth's hidden layers. For a time, the earth kept its secrets. Well after well was drilled, equipment whined, pipes shuddered. Men wiped sweat from their brows, shielded their eyes from blowing dust, and waited for the sign that would justify the enormous cost. Small amounts of oil appeared, enough to tease, not enough to confirm. The engineers grew tense. The financial men back in America grew nervous. One American geologist, standing at the edge of the drilling site late one afternoon, looked out over the flat land, the heat shimmering like invisible waves. "Maybe we were wrong," he muttered. "Maybe there's nothing here." Beside him, a Saudi worker wrapped his cloak tighter against the hot wind. "The desert hides what it wants," the worker said quietly. "Sometimes it tests how badly you want to find it." The king's patience. In Riyadh, reports traveled slowly but steadily. Each one carried fragments of technical language, translated into plain words for the king. "We have drilled again," his advisors would say. "They have found signs, but no great flow yet." Some in his circle began to doubt. "Your Majesty," one warned, "what if they find nothing? We have given them rights over our land. We have staked hope on something that may not exist." Abdulaziz listened, then nodded toward the east. "Our people have wandered these lands for generations," he said. "They have seen seepages, smelled strange black liquid in some places. The signs are there. And even if we are not sure, we must try. A kingdom like ours cannot live forever only on the backs of pilgrims and the patience of foreign governments." He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. "And remember, even their trying strengthens us. They build roads, they bring knowledge. If they fail, they lose money. We lose only time if they succeed." He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. One evening, after the sunset prayer, he walked slowly through the courtyard of his residence. The call of the muezzin still echoed faintly in the air. A soft breeze moved through the palm leaves overhead. In the distance, someone recited Quran, the words drifting like a calm river through the night. He looked up at the stars, the same stars that had watched him as a boy in exile, the same stars that had watched him take back Riyadh, fight the Rashidis, and unite the peninsula. So much of this land is still hidden, he thought. Its hearts, its future, its wealth. We dig into the ground to find what God has buried there, but what will that discovery do to us? Will it make us stronger, or will it test us in ways we do not yet see? He had built his rule on simplicity, on courage, faith, and the shared hardship of desert life. If rivers of money began to flow, they would bring comfort. But they might also bring laziness, division, and foreign interference dressed in new clothes. In the east, the drills continued their slow, grinding work. The desert, as always, gave nothing easily. Until one day it did. Far from Riyadh, on a rise overlooking the Dammam field, a worker shaded his eyes with his hand and stared at the latest well, Dammam number 7, as the drill ground deeper than any of its predecessors had dared. The air smelled of hot metal and sweat. The men's faces were tense, their movements automatic, worn by repetition and uncertainty. Then deep below, something shifted. The drill pipes shuddered, pressure gauges jumped. A new, thick smell rose from the earth, sharp, oily, undeniable. Black liquid surged upward, dark and gleaming in the harsh sun. A shout went up, then another. Men ran, stumbling through the sand, half laughing, half crying. Hats flew into the air. Someone yelled, in English and rough Arabic mixed together, "We found it, we found it." Oil. The genie was out of the bottle. Oil. The genie was out of the bottle. The fountain shot upward in a thick, dark column, splattering across the machinery, coating the sand in a gleaming black sheen. Men stumbled back, shielding their faces as droplets rained down on them, sticking to their clothes and skin. The roar of the gusher drowned out the shouts, a deep, thunderous sound like the earth itself exhaling after centuries of holding its breath. For a moment, no one moved. Then pandemonium broke loose. American engineers leapt and waved their arms, their voices rising into the baking sky. Saudi workers laughed aloud, some raising their hands to God in instinctive gratitude. Others dropped to their knees right where they were, the hot sand burning through their trousers as they pressed their foreheads to the earth. The desert had changed. Not slowly, not gradually, but in the space of a breath. One of the American drill supervisors, his face streaked with oil, grabbed a young Saudi laborer by the shoulders and shouted over the roaring plume. "Tell your king, send word to Riyadh. Tell him his country has struck the mother lode." The message to Riyadh. In the capital, the heat lay heavy over the city as Abdulaziz sat in council. The discussion that morning was the usual mix: tribal petitions, concerns about the new police posts in the Hijaz, the cost of maintaining roads for pilgrims. Then a messenger burst through the doors, dust coating his clothing, his chest rising and falling with rapid breaths. "My king," he said, bowing low, "there is news from the east, from the Americans." The room stilled. Abdulaziz gestured, "Speak." "They say," the messenger swallowed hard as though afraid to jinx the words, "they say that the seventh well has struck oil, not a trickle, a flood. They say it shoots from the ground like a fountain. They say it may be enormous." A buzz ran through the council like an electric spark. Some men broke into excited whispers, others stared uns. "You're whether to believe such magnitude." A few murmured prayers under their breath. Abdulaziz did not leap up. He did not shout. He only closed his eyes and breathed out through his nose slowly, like a man letting a great tension release from his chest. Then he opened them again. "Alhamdulillah," he said quietly, "praise be to God." One advisor leaned forward, voice trembling. "Your Majesty, if what they say is true, this could change everything. Our debts, our roads, our armies, our relations abroad." Abdulaziz nodded once. "It will change much, but not everything." He rose, his tall frame casting a long shadow over the woven carpet. "These blessings are tests," he said. "As hardships are tests, we will see if we meet this one with discipline or with carelessness." The first visit to the oil fields. Weeks later, Abdulaziz traveled east to see the site with his own eyes. His caravan stretched across the open land like a moving constellation of riders, camels, supply wagons, and guards. Dust rose behind them in a slow, drifting cloud. When he approached the drilling camp, the sight must have seemed like a dream stitched onto the desert, steel towers jutting into the sky, storage tanks glinting under the sun, wires running across the sand like black snakes, men shouting in strange accents as they hauled tools, checked gauges, and fed the massive engines powering the rigs. An American engineer hurried forward, wiping sweat from his brow. "Your Majesty," he said through the interpreter, "welcome, it is our honor to show you the well." Abdulaziz's eyes moved across the machinery, his face calm but alert. He did not walk quickly. He took everything in: the smell of oil, the rumble of engines, the tension in the workers' movements. When he reached the edge of the platform where the well still gurgled thick, black crude, he stopped. A warm breeze carried the sharp scent directly to him. "This," he murmured, "is what has been sleeping beneath us." He crouched down and dipped 2 fingers gently into a small puddle of oil. It coated them instantly, thick and dark. He rubbed it between his thumb and forefinger, feeling the heaviness, the texture unlike anything else in the desert. "It is as if the earth bleeds wealth," one advisor whispered beside him. Abdulaziz stood and wiped his hand with a cloth. "Or bleeds temptation," he replied. Then he turned to the Americans. "You have worked hard," he said. "May your efforts be rewarded, but remember, this land is ours. Its gifts are ours, and its responsibility is ours. You are welcome here as partners, not masters." The engineer nodded vigorously. "Of course, Your Majesty, of course." But even as he spoke, A sharp calculation flickered behind his eyes. The Americans knew what this meant. So did the British. So did any nation watching from afar with the eyes of empire. A new player had entered the world economy. One with something the industrializing world desperately needed. And one who controlled a strategic coastline between east and west. Foreign eyes turned toward Arabia. In London, officials in crisp uniforms gathered in conference rooms to discuss the implications. The British had long maintained ties in the Gulf, shaping local politics through agreements, subsidies, and protectorates. Now they felt the ground shift. Oil, one official said, tapping a map of Arabia with a thin finger. In such quantities, redrawing the region may be inevitable. Another frowned, and with American involvement no less, we cannot allow the United States to dominate the Gulf. We must strengthen our ties elsewhere. Across the ocean, in Washington, policymakers pored over cables from Aramco engineers. Saudi Arabia could hold reserves on par with the greatest fields in the world, one advisor said. If the king can be kept friendly, this could be the foothold we've been waiting for in the Middle East. Friendly. The word would echo for decades. The price of power. Back in Arabia, the world's attention, once faint and distant, now began to intensify. Ships anchored off the eastern coast more frequently. Foreign diplomats sent letters requesting meetings with the king. Companies offered partnerships, equipment, loans. And money began to flow. The treasury swelled, roads were repaired, ports modernized, schools opened. For the first time in its history, the kingdom had the means to build, not just survive. But Abdulaziz watched the transformation with a deep, private caution. What we gain, he told his sons one night in a quiet majlis, may cost us something else. Foreigners will come. Even if we invite them only for business, they will bring their habits, their influence, their desires. Oil will make us rich, yes, but it may also make us dependent, and dependency is a chain. A young prince asked, then why accept their help? Because, Abdulaziz said, a king who refuses opportunity condemns his people to need, but a king who embraces opportunity blindly condemns them to loss. We must walk the thin path between the two. He let that settle in the air, like a sword balanced on its edge. Oil is power, he said, and all power has a price. A new era begins. By the end of the 1930s, wells multiplied across the eastern province. Pipelines snaked across the desert. American encampments grew into small towns of their own, complete with electricity, air conditioning, and basketball courts, luxuries unimaginable elsewhere in the kingdom. Workers from across Arabia flocked to the oil fields seeking wages. Their lives changed. Their expectations changed. Their understanding of the world changed. And slowly, even if he did not wish it, Abdulaziz's kingdom began to step into the modern era. But not without conflict. The Ikhwan, those zealous warriors who had helped him conquer much of Arabia, looked upon these changes with suspicion. They saw foreign engineers in short-sleeved shirts. They saw machines that hummed through the night. They saw laws and policies shifting to accommodate foreign needs, and in their eyes, the purity of the early mission began to blur. Some whispered that the king had allowed unbelievers too much influence. Others questioned the direction of the new wealth. For the first time, the pact of faith and sword began to strain. Abdulaziz sensed it. He felt the tension gathering, like heat rising before a sandstorm. He had awakened the kingdom's wealth. He had drawn the world's gaze. And he had tied the fate of his nation to the engines of a global economy. What he did not yet know was that the greatest challenge to his vision would soon come not from distant empires, but from the very men who had once fought under his banner with absolute conviction. The greatest challenge to his vision did not arrive with drums or foreign flags. It arrived as a question whispered in the hearts of men who had once believed they were building a different kind of world. In the camps of the Ikhwan, far from the growing oil fields and the strange glow of electric lights, discontent hardened like cooling metal. Men who had lived through the early campaigns remembered days when their lives were simple: pray, ride, fight, and believe that every step of their horses' hooves carried them closer to God's favor. Now they heard of foreigners living in fenced compounds, untouched by local judges. They heard of new rules and written contracts. They heard that the king sat with infidels, drank coffee with them, signed papers in their language. To them, it felt like the clear lines of the old mission were being smudged. Around low fires, under skies sharp with stars, Ikhwan leaders murmured their unease. "We were told," one said, his face lit orange by flame, "that we fought to cleanse the land of foreign influence and corrupt practices. Now unbelievers are invited in, given land, given protection." Another nodded, jaw tight. "We fought to end certain habits, but in the Hijaz and other towns some customs still remain, music still plays, women still walk the markets. We were promised more." Their anger was not just about oil or foreigners. It was about a feeling, a sense that the world they had bled for was changing in ways they had not agreed to. To Abdulaziz, this tension was like a crack in a foundation he had spent decades laying. He tried to address it with words first. He invited Ikhwan leaders to councils. He sat with them on the same rough cushions he had always used, looked them in the eye, and spoke plainly. "We live in a new time," he said. "We cannot close our eyes to the world. Oil is a gift from God, and we must use it to strengthen the land of Islam. The foreigners are here under our conditions, not theirs. We take their knowledge and money, we do not take their beliefs." "But Imam," one of the more defiant Ikhwan leaders replied, "if we allow their machines, their ways, their presence, will their ideas not follow? Are we to accept unbelief so that we may have comfort?" Silence followed his question, heavy and sharp. Abdulaziz's answer was calm but steel-lined. "We do not accept unbelief," he said. "We manage it. We keep it outside our people's hearts while using what benefits us. If you believe we should turn away from these opportunities, tell me, how will we feed our people? How will we defend our borders? How will we keep foreign armies from carving up this land as they have done in other places?" The Ikhwan leaders had no easy reply, but doubt, once awakened, did not sleep again. In the years that followed, their dissatisfaction grew into open defiance. They raided where they had been told not to raid. They attacked British-protected tribes and caravans, ignoring the king's orders, believing that their understanding of religious duty outweighed his political agreements. It was a terrible choice, but a clear one. Either the state would bend to the most extreme demands of its own zeal, or it would assert its authority, even at the cost of blood. The confrontation came to a head in 1929 on a field called Sabila. There, under a harsh, remorseless sun, forces loyal to the king faced rebellious Ikhwan fighters who had once been his sharpest sword. Dust rose in great clouds as horsemen charged. Machine guns, a new and deadly element in the desert, cut across the open space with relentless fire. The battle was short and devastating. When the smoke cleared, the Ikhwan revolt was broken. Abdulaziz walked the field afterward, the smell of gunpowder still bitter in the air. Bodies lay scattered across the sand, men who had prayed with him, fought with him, once called him Imam with tears in their eyes. Now they were still, their rifles fallen from hands that would never rise again. He did not celebrate. "This," he told a close confidant, voice low and tired, "is the heaviest price I have paid. To keep order, I had to crush the very men who helped me build it." The message was unmistakable. There would be no second power in his realm, no armed movement allowed to stand beside or over the authority of the state, no matter how pious its language. The kingdom stepped into a new phase, the age of building institutions, signing agreements abroad, managing oil, and balancing faith with the cold math of politics. The fire of early zeal had been contained inside the walls of the state. It would never disappear. It would smolder, glowing faintly, sometimes flaring in unexpected places. But from that day, the House of Saud made it clear. Not any band of warriors would decide where faith met power. Years passed. Oil flowed in greater quantities. The world edged toward catastrophe as new wars loomed on the horizon. The Second World War erupted, pulling empires into conflict. Saudi Arabia remained formally neutral, but its location and its oil drew attention in ways that would leave permanent marks. In February 1945, as that war neared its end, an American warship, the USS Quincy, floated on the calm waters of the Suez Canal. On its deck, two elderly men, each powerful in his own world, prepared to meet. One wore a dark suit, his body frail from illness, his legs covered by a blanket. Franklin D. Roosevelt, President of the United States. The other arrived in dignified desert robes, carried by sailors when he boarded because his legs were too swollen to climb with ease. King Abdulaziz ibn Saud, founder of the new Saudi state. They sat facing each other under a tinted canopy on the ship's deck as the water glinted around them. Interpreters moved between them like bridges of sound. They spoke of many things, of Palestine and the fate of its people, of post-war plans, of the needs of their nations. Beneath it all moved a quieter understanding. America needed oil. Saudi Arabia needed security, technology, and investment. The handshake they shared did not look dramatic. It was not accompanied by trumpets or shouting crowds. Yet it symbolized a new kind of pact, not the old alliance between preacher and emir, but a global deal between a desert king and an industrial superpower. A deal that would outlive them both. As Abdulaziz's ship carried him home, the sea breeze cooled his lined face. Behind him, the age of pure isolation was gone. Ahead of him, his sons would inherit a kingdom whose wealth tied it to factories and freeways thousands of miles away. He had turned exile into rule, sand into statehood, and now Earth's hidden black rivers into political leverage. But with each victory, the stakes had risen, the stage had widened, and the risks had grown more dangerous. The House of Saud stood now not only under the desert sky, but under the gaze of a watching world. And in the years after Abdulaziz's death, that world would test the kingdom with wars, revolutions, and fires that reached all the way to the walls of the holiest mosque on earth. Oil had bound Saudi Arabia to the world. Now it began to bind the world to Saudi Arabia. In the years after Abdulaziz's meeting with Roosevelt, the relationship deepened. American engineers and executives came and went. Saudi officials visited refineries abroad. Aramco grew from a foreign concession into a sprawling machine, carving roads through the desert, erecting housing compounds, building ports and airstrips. Then in 1953, the old king's body finally gave out. He died in his bed in Taif, the cool mountain town where he often retreated from the furnace heat below. His chest rose and fell more slowly until it did not rise again. Outside, the wind moved through the trees with the same indifferent sigh it had given to the deaths of countless men before him. In Riyadh, the announcement spread through markets, mosques, and ministries. Al-Malik Abdulaziz is dead. For many Saudis, it felt as though a mountain had disappeared from the horizon. But the state he had built did not vanish with him. It moved into the hands of his sons. King Saud, his designated heir, inherited a kingdom whose wealth was rising with each year of oil exports. But he also inherited a complicated legacy, a growing bureaucracy, an increasingly entangled relationship with the West, and a people whose expectations were beginning to rise along with state revenues. Palaces expanded. New buildings went up in Riyadh and Jeddah, their architecture part traditional, part modern. Government ministries took shape, staffed with young men in gutras and agals leafing through papers and typewritten reports instead of spear shafts. Western cars rolled along newly paved roads, their engines rumbling where once only hooves had sounded. In small villages, electricity arrived like a quiet miracle, wires stretching out like black veins from newly installed poles. Children stared in wonder as bulbs flickered to life in houses that had only known lantern light. Yet with each step forward, new tensions appeared. King Saud's spending was generous, some said reckless. Palaces multiplied, state debts rose, and questions began to whisper through the halls of power. Was the kingdom's new wealth being used wisely, or was it slipping through fingers oiled by luxury? One prince watched these changes with a cooler eye. Faisal, Abdulaziz's sober, sharp-minded son who had served as foreign minister and prime minister. Where Saud was lavish, Faisal was controlled. Where Saud loved ceremony, Faisal loved silence. Over time, as financial strains worsened and internal complaints grew louder, the balance shifted. In 1964, after a carefully managed internal process in which religious scholars were asked to approve, King Saud was removed. Faisal took the throne. It was a quiet revolution from within the palace walls, a sign that even within the House of Saud, power could change hands when necessity demanded. Under King Faisal, the pace of modernization quickened, but with a watchful regard for religious authority. Schools for boys and, cautiously, for girls expanded. Television was introduced, beaming moving pictures into living rooms and coffee houses. Some conservatives protested. One young prince even joined a demonstration against television, calling it a corrupting influence. Faisal, torn between tradition and progress, stood firm. "We cannot close our eyes to the world," he said. "We must look carefully and take what benefits us and reject what harms us." His words echoed the same balancing act his father had tried to walk, only now the tightrope stretched across a much higher drop. Beyond Saudi borders, the region itself was boiling. In Cairo, Gamal Abdel Nasser's voice crackled over radios, calling for Arab unity and revolution, denouncing monarchies and Western influence. His speeches reached deep into Saudi homes, carried on late-night broadcasts that young men listened to in secret, their faces lit by the dim glow of the radio dial. Why do they rule us? Some listeners wondered quietly. Why not a republic? Why not something new? Faisal understood the danger. He tightened control but also tried to answer some of the frustrations, investing in welfare programs, building infrastructure, presenting his rule as both Islamic and reform-minded, different from the decaying monarchies Nasser mocked. Then came 1967, the Six-Day War, in which Arab armies suffered a swift and humiliating defeat at the hands of Israel. Shock reverberated across the region. The confidence that Nasser had projected cracked. Crowds that once cheered him now looked for something to blame. Once again, Saudi Arabia's role shifted quietly. It became a place where wounded Arab pride came seeking support, where leaders flew in and out for emergency summits, where money and quiet diplomacy replaced slogans and marching crowds. The kingdom had become rich enough to write checks when others ran out of breath. But it was in 1973 that Saudi oil would truly slam its fist on the table of global politics. That autumn during the Yom Kippur War, Arab states fought Israel once again. As the battles unfolded, the United States and other Western nations resupplied Israeli forces. In response, key Arab oil producers, led in large part by King Faisal's Saudi Arabia, decided to use their new weapon, oil supply. They declared an embargo on oil exports to countries seen as supporting Israel. Tankers slowed or stopped. Supplies tightened. In Western cities thousands of kilometers away, drivers found themselves queuing for hours at gas stations, engines off, tempers hot. News anchors spoke of energy crisis and dependence on foreign oil with a new tremor in their voices. For the first time, Many people who had never heard the word Riyadh spoke it with a mix of frustration and grudging respect. In palaces and ministries, the numbers surged. Oil prices jumped several times over. Revenues flowed into the Saudi treasury like a flood. The kingdom had discovered that oil was more than money. It was leverage. Yet for King Faisal, who walked with a limp and wore simple robes despite his power, the moment was not one of triumph alone. In private, he remained somber. "What we hold," he told visitors, "is a trust from God. If we use it only for our comfort, it will destroy us. If we use it wisely, it can uplift the Muslim world." He pushed for development: universities, hospitals, roads, a modern bureaucracy. Saudi students were sent abroad on scholarships to Cairo, London, Washington, and beyond. They would return with new knowledge and new questions. Then, in 1975, the kingdom was shaken by another shock not measured in barrels or banknotes, but in blood. During a routine meeting in Riyadh, King Faisal was approached by a young prince, a member of his own extended family. The prince drew a pistol and fired. The king fell, mortally wounded. The room erupted in screams and chaos. The motives were tangled: personal grievances, political confusion, perhaps mental instability. But the result was simple and brutal. The architect of modern Saudi Arabia's cautious balancing act lay dead. Once again, the House of Saud shifted its weight. Khalid, another of Abdulaziz's sons, took the throne, with the energetic, business-minded Prince Fahd close at his side. The oil money kept flowing. Construction cranes dotted the skylines of Riyadh, Jeddah, and Dammam. Highways stretched where camel tracks once ran. Air-conditioned shopping centers rose from land where only tents had stood. But under the cool blast of the new air conditioners, under the smooth concrete of new roads, pressure was building. Some Saudis felt the changes were too fast, too shallow, too dependent on foreigners. Others felt they were too slow, too bound by conservative religious constraints. The sons of peasants now studied engineering. The sons of Bedouin now sat behind desks as bureaucrats. The gap between the life of the grandfathers and the life of the grandsons widened into a canyon. In the holy city of Mecca, where millions circled the Kaaba each year in white garments, some young men began to see a widening crack between the kingdom's glittering new wealth and its claim to religious purity. They studied the Quran. They listened to fiery preachers. They watched as televisions flickered in hotels built with oil money, as Western banks opened branches, as royal limousines glided past poor neighborhoods. "Is this," they asked themselves in the quiet of their hearts, "the rule we were promised? Is this what it means to guard the two holy mosques?" One of them, a former soldier named Juhayman al-Adaybi, felt those questions harden into certainty. A certainty that would soon lead him to take rifles into the holiest place in Islam. For decades, oil had strengthened the House of Saud, feeding its authority and funding its ambitions. Now, rising from the same desert that had given the Sauds their first warriors, a new kind of challenge approached, one that would not come from foreign powers or rival dynasties, but from within the kingdom's own religious heart. In the shadow of the Kaaba, a different kind of storm was gathering. Kingdom under fire, crises, revolts, and the battle for survival. The dawn call to prayer rose over Mecca like it had for more than 1,000 years. The sky was still faintly purple, the first light of morning just beginning to touch the white marble of the Grand Mosque. Inside its vast courtyard, pilgrims moved in slow circles around the Kaaba, their white garments glowing softly in the dimness. Some wept, some whispered supplications, some simply walked in silence, letting their hearts speak. The air smelled of sweat, dust, and the faint sweetness of incense. Pigeons fluttered in sudden bursts over the rooflines. Footsteps tapped gently against stone. A quiet peace held the sacred space. Then, like a thread snapping, the peace broke. A strange movement surged at the edges of the courtyard. Men in ordinary clothing, carrying stretchers as if bearing bodies for prayer, began to shift positions. They were not grieving, they were waiting. At a signal invisible to most pilgrims, they swung the stretchers down and tore them open. Not bodies. Guns. The crack of rifle fire shattered the dawn. Screams tore through the murmur of prayer. Pilgrims scattered, some dropping to the ground, others running toward any corner that seemed like shelter. Smoke began to curl upward as shots echoed across the stone. At the center of the storm, a group of armed men pushed inward, seizing control of gates, towers, and galleries. Their leader, Juhayman al-Adebai, stepped forward with a megaphone in hand, his voice cutting harshly through the chaos. "Muslims," he cried, "the Mahdi has come, the rulers have betrayed God, this place must be cleansed." His words rushed out, soaked in conviction and fury. The men around him unfurled banners, dragged loudspeakers into position, and began fortifying the holiest mosque in Islam as if it were a fortress in a war. Outside in the city's narrow streets, the news spread like fire through dry grass. The Grand Mosque seized. Impossible. By who? By our own. In Riyadh, the message that reached the royal court landed like a blow. Armed insurgents had taken the Grand Mosque. They had locked the gates. They had taken hostages. They claimed that the royal family had betrayed Islam and that a new era must begin. For the House of Saud, which had built its entire legitimacy on protecting the two holy mosques, it was a nightmare made real. Word by word, detail by detail, the reports poured in. The militants were well-armed, disciplined, fanatical. They had stocked food, ammunition, even water inside the mosque. They had chosen the moment carefully at the turn of the Islamic century, a date heavy with prophetic symbolism. Now they were using that symbolism like a blade. King Khalid, shaken, sat with senior princes and commanders in an emergency council. Maps of Mecca and the mosque complex lay spread before them, the neat lines of architecture suddenly feeling like a puzzle designed to frustrate any rescue. "How many?" a prince demanded. "Hundreds," an officer replied. "Some say more." "Foreigners?" another asked. "No," the officer said. "They are Saudis, some from the Ikhwan legacy, some from the National Guard, some former students, our own." The silence that followed was worse than shouting. To attack this group would mean sending Saudi soldiers to fight Saudi insurgents inside the most sacred space on earth. Every bullet fired, every grenade thrown would feel like a violation, but to do nothing would be worse. It would mean losing control of the heart of Islam. "The scholars," one prince said, "we must have their ruling." Religious scholars were quickly gathered. They sat with lined faces and serious eyes, listening to descriptions of the siege, the claims of Juhayman's group, the fear spreading among believers everywhere. "Is it lawful," they were asked, "to use force in the Grand Mosque to remove these men?" They conferred, hearts heavy with the weight of tradition and necessity. In the end, they ruled that it was. The sanctity of the mosque, they said, must be protected from those who had violated it first. To allow them to hold it by force, preaching rebellion and bloodshed, was a greater crime than to fight them there. The decision was like a green signal, given with trembling hands. Back in Mecca, the courtyard that had echoed with prayer now echoed with the sharp crack of skirmishes. Security forces tried to probe the edges, to test the militants' positions. They were met with furious resistance. Some soldiers fell. Others staggered back, shaken not just by the gunfire but by the place where it was happening. Every pillar, every arch, every stone carried centuries of worship. Now it carried the scorch marks of bullets. The siege dragged on, day after suffocating day. Inside, the insurgents broadcast messages through loudspeakers, denouncing the royal family, accusing them of corruption, of betraying the faith, of allowing Western influence and immorality to seep into the kingdom. Outside in the wider world, Governments watched with disbelief. The Grand Mosque attacked, newscasters murmured, by extremists from inside Saudi Arabia. It was a moment that cracked open a deeper truth. The same strict religious tradition that had once powered the rise of the House of Saud could, in a different form, turn against it. For decades, the kingdom had walked a line funding religious institutions, upholding conservative norms, aligning itself with clerics, while also modernizing, trading with the West, and managing oil. Now that line looked thin as thread. In quiet rooms, senior princes stared at maps and listened to radio reports, understanding that this was more than a security crisis. It was a crisis of identity. "Who are we?" one of them asked softly, "if those who share our creed now say we are traitors to it?" As the days passed, the militants pressed deeper into the underground areas of the mosque, a maze of tunnels, storerooms, columns, and shadows. It became a battle not just of guns, but of nerves, patience, and faith itself. Saudi forces tried everything they could on their own: tear gas, careful advances, appeals through bullhorns, even attempts to flush the insurgents out without heavy destruction. But the militants were entrenched, fanatical. They believed they were living the final pages of prophecy. Death did not frighten them. It beckoned. Pressure mounted. The eyes of the Muslim world were on Mecca. Rumors spread like smoke, that the mosque had fallen, that the Mahdi was truly inside, that the end of days was near. In this suffocating atmosphere, the Saudi leadership made a decision they hoped would never be revealed: to seek technical help from foreign specialists in clearing underground strongholds. The arrangement was wrapped in secrecy. Any outside experts would be kept away from the holy places themselves. Saudi officers would lead. The scholars' ruling would still guide what weapons and tactics could be used. But the fact remained: to save their control over the holiest site, they would quietly lean on knowledge from beyond the lands of Islam. It was a terrible irony for a kingdom that had once defined itself by rejecting foreign presence in its core. Still, in the grim logic of survival, they saw no other path. The stage was set for a final, brutal push, one that would end the siege, but leave scars on the kingdom's conscience that would not heal easily. Inside the mosque's darkened underground halls, Juhayman's followers checked their weapons and whispered prayers, convinced that whatever came next would carry them straight into God's judgment. Outside, soldiers adjusted their helmets, tightened their grips on their rifles, and tried to steady their breath. The House of Saud stood on a knife edge between religious rebellion and state collapse, between its past as defender of the holy places and its future as a modern, oil-rich power trying to hold together a society pulled in opposite directions. Somewhere deep in the stone foundations of Mecca, footsteps began to move into position. The countdown to the final assault had begun. They moved at dawn. The sky over Mecca was a pale, bruised gray, the first hints of sunlight struggling to break through. Around the Grand Mosque, the city held its breath. Streets that were usually alive with vendors and pilgrims were now locked down, guarded by nervous soldiers whose fingers twitched on triggers. Inside the royal command room, maps of the mosque lay spread across a large table. Colored marks showed stairwells, gallery entrances, minarets, and the twisting tunnels beneath. Officers traced lines of approach with blunt fingertips, murmuring into radios, checking watches. "Begin," came the order at last. At the mosque's outer edges, loudspeakers crackled to life. "To those inside," a firm voice called, "you are ordered to surrender. Lay down your arms, leave this sacred place. You have been misled. Do not die in a state of rebellion." Silence answered at first. Then faintly came the militants' reply, angry words about corrupt rulers, betrayal, and the coming of the Mahdi. They would not leave. They would not surrender. The final assault began. Saudi forces pushed inward, step by cautious step. They wore gas masks, their breaths loud in their own ears, hearts hammering beneath thick vests. Tear gas canisters clattered across marble. Smoke drifted through colonnades, seeping into the underground passages where the insurgents had dug in. In the dim corridors below, the gas rolled like a low fog, clawing at throats and eyes. Some militants coughed and stumbled, firing blindly into the haze. Others fell back deeper into the catacombs, choking but still clutching their rifles. Above in the main prayer hall, the air shook with the echo of gunfire. Bullets struck stone, sent chips flying, left scars along pillars that had watched centuries of peaceful worship. Soldiers cried out. So did insurgents. Some fell and did not rise. The battle was not clean. It was not quick. It was a grim, grinding push through a place never meant for war. To move forward, the attackers used methods that felt almost unbearable in such a space. They blew open doors that had seen only pilgrims pass. They hurled grenades into shadowed recesses. They fired carefully into corners where militants hid behind piles of supplies and terrified hostages. Every trigger pulled inside those walls was an act carried out with a mixture of duty and dread. Outside, radio broadcasts tried to calm a shaken population. "The mosque will be liberated," announcers said. "The sanctity of the holy place will be restored. Pray for those who are trying to save it." But rumors were hard to catch. Some said the Kaaba had been damaged. Others said the black stone was gone. Fear does not wait for facts. Deep below, in the darkest chambers, Juhayman and his closest followers made their last stand. Surrounded, running low on water and ammunition, they prayed, wept, shouted verses, and insisted to each other that their deaths would be a victory recorded by angels if not by men. When the final push came, it was brutal. Flashes lit the underground as shots cracked through the narrow spaces. Men fell in the shadows. Boots splashed through pools of spilled water and blood. Commands rang out in hoarse, exhausted voices. And then, slowly, the silence that followed was not the tense quiet of waiting, but the heavy quiet of something having ended. The siege was over. The Grand Mosque, battered, scorched, and scarred, was once again under the control of the state. In the days that followed, workers scrubbed and repaired. Bullet marks remained on some pillars, faint but real, like the memory of a fever the body had survived but not forgotten. The Kaaba stood, untouched. The circuits of Tawaf resumed. Pilgrims returned, tears running down their faces as they walked, grateful that the heart of their faith still beat. But the kingdom itself had changed. In Riyadh, courts moved quickly. Those who had survived the siege were interrogated, tried, and sentenced. Juhayman and many of his followers were executed, their bodies returned to the dust of the land they had tried to remake by force. Official statements called them criminals, extremists, betrayers of the faith. Many Saudis agreed. They had seen too much horror, heard too many stories from Mecca to feel sympathy. And yet beneath the anger, a quieter question lingered. How had such men, raised under the same religious teachings the state itself promoted, come to see the state as the enemy of that very faith? For the House of Saud, the answer was terrifying, because it pointed back at its own foundations. If the kingdom's legitimacy rested on custodianship of holy places and upholding Islam, then any group claiming to fix the kingdom in the name of purer religion struck at its very core. Shaken by the siege, the leadership made a choice. They would not abandon their alliance with religious scholars. They would deepen it. Concessions followed. Religious authorities were given even greater influence over education, media, and social norms. Strict codes of public behavior were strengthened. Visible symbols of piety, long beards, abayas, gender segregation became not just common, but defining markers of Saudi life. The message was clear: we are not weak, we are not lax, we are more Islamic than those who dared accuse us. It was, in a way, a defensive move, a way of pulling the country tighter around its religious identity to keep instability out. but it also planted seeds for future tension by narrowing the space for change. Outside Saudi Arabia, 1979 was also the year of the Iranian Revolution. Across the Gulf in Tehran, the Shah's regime collapsed under the weight of protests, strikes, and religious political unrest. Ayatollah Khomeini returned from exile, greeted by cheering crowds. A new Islamic Republic was declared, its leaders speaking in fiery tones about exporting revolution, challenging monarchies, and standing up to the West. In Saudi palaces, television images of Iranian crowds chanting against kings and America flickered in dim rooms. Some princes shifted uneasily in their seats. The Iranian leader's words struck close to home. They claimed they represented true Islamic governance. They called monarchies decadent, compromised. They spoke of a different model of religious state. For Saudi Arabia, the threat was not just military, it was ideological. To the kingdom's Shia minority in the eastern province, where many of the oil wells stood, the Iranian Revolution sent a different signal, that religiously framed opposition to a monarchy was possible. Protests began to stir. Demonstrations were met with force. Tension thickened along the Gulf Coast. By the dawn of the 1980s, Saudi Arabia found itself squeezed between two kinds of fire. On one side, the memory of jihadist zeal spilling into Mecca. On the other, a revolutionary Shia regime across the water, denouncing it as a puppet of the West. And yet the kingdom remained standing, steady, cautious, adapting as it had always done. When the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979, a new front opened, one that would entangle Saudi Arabia in a long and fateful story. Alongside the United States and Pakistan, the Saudis poured money into supporting Afghan resistance fighters. Mosques across the kingdom called for donations. Young men were urged, sometimes subtly, sometimes openly, to go and fight in defense of Muslim lands. Plane tickets were purchased. Camps were set up. A generation of fighters learned how to wage war in mountain passes and bombed-out villages. Among them were men who would one day turn their weapons against their own homeland. But in those early years, they were seen as heroes. The House of Saud had weathered the storm in Mecca, asserted its religious credentials, and now, by funding and supporting the Afghan jihad, it presented itself once again as a frontline defender of Islam, this time against godless communism. The contradictions were deepening. Oil wealth, Western alliances, strict religious codes, secret foreign interventions. All bundled into a single state that still called itself simply Al-Mamlaka al-Arabiya as-Saudiyya, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. The cracks would not show fully until the 1990s, when a new crisis exploded just beyond its borders, and the kingdom invited foreign soldiers onto its soil in numbers that would shock many of its own sons. In the glow of streetlights newly strung across highways and the hum of air conditioners in concrete apartment blocks, Saudi society was changing fast. But underground, quieter forces were also changing, hardening under the weight of hypocrisy they thought they saw, waiting for their moment to speak in fire. The next shock would not come from within Mecca's walls, but from a neighboring ruler's sudden move, and the roar of tanks rolling into Kuwait. The tanks rolled before dawn. In August 1990, the Kuwaiti desert, usually quiet beneath wide, pale skies, thundered with the sound of engines. Iraqi forces poured across the border, their treads grinding the sand, their flags snapping in the hot wind. Within days, Kuwait City fell. Its streets, once lined with neon-lit shops and calm boulevards, echoed with the sharp bark of foreign soldiers' commands. The shock spread across the Gulf like a jolt. In Riyadh, maps were unrolled again. But this time, the red lines of invasion lay almost on the kingdom's doorstep. The Iraqi army, powerful, battle-hardened from its long war with Iran, now sat on Saudi Arabia's northern border, its leader, Saddam Hussein, speaking in grand, dangerous tones. Next, some whispered, he will look south. Saudi satellites and scouts reported Iraqi units massing near the frontier. The thought of that army crossing the sand toward the oil fields of the eastern province and the holy cities in the west sent a cold current through the royal court. King Fahd, now on the throne, listened to his generals and advisors as they listed options. Their voices were calm, but the fear beneath their words was clear. "We are not ready," one officer admitted. "Our forces are strong, but not enough to stand alone against a full Iraqi assault. If he moves, we may not be able to stop him before he reaches deep into our territory." There was another option, one that would have seemed unthinkable in earlier generations. Call in foreign armies, and not just in small numbers, not as distant partners, but on Saudi soil itself. American, British, and other Western forces, equipped with jets, tanks, and high technology, were already preparing to confront Saddam. For them, Saudi territory would be a perfect staging ground, air bases, ports, and open desert to deploy in. For Saudi leaders, the choice was cruelly simple: risk invasion and possible occupation by a neighboring dictator, or invite tens of thousands of non-Muslim soldiers into the land that held Mecca and Medina. In long, heavy meetings, the arguments clashed. "If we allow this," some warned, "many of our people will see it as a betrayal. They will say we have brought unbelieving armies into the heart of Islam." "And if we do not," others replied, "what will they say when Iraqi tanks rumble past our cities and our mosques? What good is independence if we lose the ground beneath our feet?" King Fahd made his decision. He would ask the United States and its allies to send forces to protect the kingdom and push Iraq out of Kuwait. Soon after, the sound of engines rolled into Saudi Arabia on a scale never seen before. Massive cargo planes landed at airbases, their bellies opening to unload tanks, armored vehicles, and equipment. Convoys of American soldiers rolled down Saudi highways, their uniforms dusty, their faces young and focused, their flags stitched to their sleeves. In quiet neighborhoods, Saudi families peered from behind curtains at the strange sight. Foreign troops passing palm groves, foreign accents in gas stations, foreign boots in the sand. On television, King Fahd addressed his people, his voice steady, appealing to necessity and legitimacy. "We are under threat," he said. "We have sought the help of our allies to repel aggression and defend the land of Islam. This is a temporary measure, forced upon us by the reckless actions of others." Many Saudis accepted his reasoning. They saw Saddam's invasion as a crime, a step too far. They understood that their own army could not stand alone. But not everyone agreed. Among those who watched the arrival of foreign troops with growing anger was a man whose name the world would soon learn: Osama bin Laden. Bin Laden was the son of a wealthy construction family, raised in privilege but drawn to the harsh romance of jihad. He had spent years in Afghanistan during the Soviet War, helping to fund and support fighters, building networks, connecting wealthy Gulf donors to the resistance. He believed he had seen the power of faith in battle, ragged men defeating a superpower with conviction and courage. When Iraq invaded Kuwait, bin Laden approached the Saudi leadership with his own proposal. "Let me bring my fighters from Afghanistan," he suggested. "Let us defend the kingdom. We do not need Western armies. We can protect our holy land ourselves." To him, it was a simple equation. As the faithful had stood against the Soviets, so they could stand against Saddam. To the Saudi leadership, it was something else entirely. They saw a man with passion, yes, but also with dangerous illusions, and a network they did not fully control. The Iraqi army was not the scattered Soviet columns in Afghan mountains. It was a modern, organized force with tanks, aircraft, and chemical weapons. Bin Laden's men were courageous, but they could not stop an armored division on open desert. His offer was politely rejected. The kingdom would turn to America, not to Friel. and jihadists for its survival. For bin Laden, the rejection was more than a personal slight. It was, in his mind, a sign of deep corruption, a sign that the rulers he had once admired trusted Western armies more than their own Islamic vanguard. When foreign troops were invited in, his disappointment hardened into fury. From that anger slowly, a new enemy took shape. Operation Desert Shield, and then Desert Storm, unfolded with terrifying speed. Coalition jets streaked across the sky, their engines shrieking, leaving vapor trails behind them. Explosions flashed over Iraqi positions. Television networks carried live footage, green-tinted images of bombs falling on distant targets. For the first time in history, war in the Middle East was broadcast into living rooms in real time. Saudi cities felt far from the front lines, yet they were not untouched. When Saddam's forces fired Scud missiles toward Riyadh and other locations, sirens wailed in the night. Families scrambled for gas masks in fear of chemical warheads. Some huddled in interior rooms, the walls shaking with distant impacts. And yet within months, the war was over. Iraqi forces were driven from Kuwait. Coalition troops celebrated. Kuwait city streets filled with returning citizens. Saudi Arabia remained unoccupied, its borders intact. But the price had been paid in something more subtle than land. For many Saudi conservatives and Islamists, the image of American troops praying in their own way on Saudi soil, of women soldiers driving on roads where Saudi women could not, of foreign bases near sacred sites, was an unbearable humiliation. The kingdom's rulers saw the war as a necessary defense. Some of their subjects saw it as proof that the state had lost its way. In the early 1990s, voices of dissent began to rise more openly. Some were peaceful petitions, sermons, letters from scholars and activists calling for reform, less corruption, more accountability. Others were more radical, inspired by bin Laden's growing rhetoric abroad, which now targeted not only the United States but the Saudi regime itself. In distant training camps and safe houses, men who had once fought in Afghanistan whispered of a new struggle, to punish the far enemy, the United States, and weaken the near enemy, the governments they saw as its clients. Saudi Arabia, with its foreign bases and its oil pipelines, lay directly in their sights. Throughout the 1990s, a wave of bombings and attacks shook the kingdom and its neighbors. In 1995, a car bomb exploded outside a building in Riyadh housing American military contractors. In 1996, a massive blast tore through the Khobar Towers complex in Dhahran, where U.S. Air Force personnel were housed. The explosions shattered concrete, shattered glass, shattered any illusion that the kingdom was immune to the violence brewing at its edges. Each time the government condemned the attacks, tightened security, arrested suspects. But beneath the police work lay a deeper effort to reclaim the religious narrative. Mosques echoed with official sermons condemning extremism, reminding worshippers that rebellion and terrorism were forbidden in Islam. The state tried to draw a line between true religious observance, loyal, conservative, quiet, and the militant ideology rising from the margins. For a while, it seemed possible to contain it. Then came September 11, 2001. On that clear New York morning, as planes sliced into the Twin Towers and flames poured skyward, the world's gaze turned once again, shockingly, towards Saudi Arabia. Most of the hijackers were Saudi. The mastermind, Osama bin Laden, carried a Saudi name and a Saudi past. In palaces and ministries, the realization struck like a slap. The kingdom was now entangled in a new kind of war, one fought in shadows, in cockpit cabins, in financial networks, and on television screens. Under intense pressure from the United States and its allies, Saudi Arabia moved against al-Qaeda's networks inside its borders. Bank accounts were scrutinized. Charities were questioned. Suspected extremists were arrested. For a time, the kingdom walked a narrow bridge, condemning the attacks, cooperating with global efforts against terrorism, yet insisting that its own religious foundations were sound, its own legitimacy intact. Al-Qaeda answered with blood. In 2003 and 2004, a series of bombings rocked Riyadh and other cities. Residential compounds, government buildings, and oil-related sites were targeted. The blasts lit up the night, sending fireballs and debris rising into the air. Sirens wailed. Hospitals overflowed. Families wept over bodies wrapped in white shrouds. This time, the war was not far away. It was in Saudi streets. Security forces responded with a fierce campaign. Gunfights broke out in urban neighborhoods. Wanted men's faces appeared on posters and television. Tips were called in. Raids were carried out behind closed doors, sometimes in the dead of night. The Saud had faced tribal enemies, religious rebels, and foreign threats before. But this fight, against small, fanatical cells willing to kill fellow Saudis in the name of purifying the state, pushed it into a new era of surveillance, intelligence, and quiet, relentless internal war. By the late 2000s, the worst of the al-Qaeda attacks inside the kingdom had been crushed. Many militants were killed. Others were captured and sent through controversial rehabilitation programs that tried to rewire their understanding of faith and obedience. For the moment, the House of Saud had survived another storm. But each crisis had left its mark, like ring lines in a tree trunk, telling the story of years of drought and flood. From the siege of Mecca to the Gulf War, from 9/11 to internal bombings, the kingdom had discovered that survival in the modern world meant more than swords and sermons. It meant managing fear, managing faith, managing oil and foreign armies and restless youth. As the new century moved forward, the royal family looked out on a population that was younger than ever, more connected than ever, more aware of world events than any generation before it. Satellite dishes bloomed on rooftops. Internet cafes buzzed with the glow of screens. Mobile phones, then smartphones, put the outside world in every pocket. The question shifted again. Could the House of Saud still command loyalty, not just with promises of stability and religious guardianship, but with real answers to the hopes and frustrations of millions of young Saudis? In 2011, from Tunis to Cairo to Libya and Syria, crowds roared through the streets, toppling rulers who had seemed unshakable only months before. On Saudi television, images of those revolutions played: smoke, chants, tanks, tear gas, presidents fleeing. In Riyadh, in Jeddah, and Qatif, people watched and wondered, will that wave reach us? Or will our kingdom find another way to change? The answer would come not in a single explosion, but in a gradual, calculated shift, led by a new generation of princes who spoke the language of vision and reform, even as they tightened the grip of the state in ways their grandfathers could hardly have imagined. The desert kingdom stood at the edge of another transformation. But this time, the battle would not be only for land or mosques. It would be for the future itself. The answer came first as a whisper, not a roar. In early 2011, when the streets of Tunis and Cairo filled with chants, Saudi Arabia did not see its own Tahrir Square. There were no endless columns of crowds filling Riyadh's wide boulevards, no presidents fleeing in helicopters from palaces overrun. But the kingdom felt the tremors. On satellite channels and new websites, Saudis watched as long-standing rulers fell in weeks. Mubarak's speeches, Gaddafi's rants, the crack of gunfire over chanting crowds, all of it flowed into Saudi homes through the glass windows of televisions and the small screens cupped in young hands. In Jeddah's cafes, in Riyadh's universities, in the cool courtyards of homes in Qatif and Hafaf, people talked more openly than before. Why them and not us? Some asked. "Because our rulers have money," others replied. "They will pay to keep the ground quiet." "Is that enough?" a quieter voice would ask, and the conversation would falter. King Abdullah, already elderly and often appearing in public with a cane and a careful gait, responded in the way he knew best, with a mix of concessions and control. He announced massive spending packages, billions for housing, salary increases, unemployment benefits, scholarships. It was as if the state reached into its deep oil-lined pockets and poured money onto all the places where it feared cracks might widen. At the same time, security services quietly made it clear that street politics would not be tolerated in the same way as in other Arab capitals. Permits for protests were rare. Those who tried to organize larger demonstrations quickly felt the cold hand of the state on their shoulders. Yet Abdullah was not only a man of checkbooks and police. He had long presented himself as a reformer within the limits of the system, cautious, conservative, but aware that the kingdom could not remain as it was forever. Under his rule, the Shura Council, an advisory body, began to include women. Universities expanded, including the new, sprawling King Abdullah University of Science and Technology on the Red Sea, where men and women studied together, a shocking sight to some eyes. He allowed a little more space for debate, a little more room for cautious questioning, always within carefully drawn boundaries. In the eastern province, however, the atmosphere was tenser. There, where a significant Shia minority lived under the gaze of oil installations and security towers, the wave of regional unrest stirred long-standing grievances. Protests broke out in towns like Qatif and Al-Awamia, calling for equality, an end to discrimination, more political participation. Security forces responded with a mixture of force and negotiation. Some protests were dispersed with bullets and arrests. Others led to promises of development and investment. Funerals for those killed became quiet acts of defiance, heavy with the knowledge that the state's attention there was sharper and less forgiving. Online, a new public square opened. Twitter accounts blossomed. Anonymous blogs appeared. Videos shot on shaky phones made their way from remote towns to the wider world. Saudis who might never have spoken in public before found themselves typing out thoughts in 140 characters, watched by thousands. The state watched too. It built new tools, cyber units, laws about online speech, quiet pressure on companies when certain voices grew too loud. But in trying to monitor the conversation, it also acknowledged a truth. The age of controlled television only was over. The conversation could not be turned off. It could only be steered, shaped, sometimes punished. King Abdullah's health declined. He spent more time in hospitals abroad, his appearances less frequent, his voice softer. Still, he moved forward small changes. Municipal elections with limited powers, more scholarships, incremental openings for women to work, to study, to sit on councils. He seemed to believe that gradual steps, wrapped in the language of tradition and faith, could keep the kingdom stable in a region tearing itself apart. Then, in 2015, he died. The news spread with a familiar rhythm. Television channels switched to Quran recitation, anchors put on somber tones, official statements spoke of loss and continuity. In the same breath, the new king was named. Salman, another son of Abdulaziz, experienced, long-time governor of Riyadh, known for his sharp memory and his quiet, formal presence. But within the palace, another shift was taking place, less visible to the public eye. A younger prince, Mohammed bin Salman, King Salman's son, moved quickly into the center of power. First as defense minister, then as deputy crown prince, then as crown prince. His rise was like a stone thrown into still water, sudden, creating ripples that spread quickly through every institution. He was in his 30s, a new generation in a system long ruled by men old enough to be his grandfathers. He spoke of vision. He spoke of 2030. He spoke the language of investors, startups, entertainment, diversification, and tech, while also promising to crush extremism and corruption with an iron hand. To many young Saudis, he looked like something they had never seen before. A prince who talked openly about change, who allowed concerts, cinemas, comic conventions, who spoke of women driving and tourists visiting as if these were not distant dreams but imminent policies. To others, the speed and the methods were alarming. In Yemen, bombs began to fall soon after his rise, as the kingdom launched a war it said was to push back Iranian influence at its border. In Riyadh, the gilded Ritz-Carlton was turned overnight into a gilded prison, as princes and businessmen were detained in an anti-corruption purge that looked to some like a cleanup, and to others like a consolidation of power. The old bargains were being rewritten. The careful slowness of Abdullah's reforms, the cautious balancing of Faisal's years, even the gradual calculations of Fahd's oil diplomacy, all of it seemed to give way to a new tempo. Faster, sharper, riskier. In the streets of Riyadh, young men and women snapped selfies at newly opened cinemas and music festivals. In quieter corners, activists and clerics who spoke out of line found their phones suddenly silent, their doors suddenly broken down at night. The House of Saud was not crumbling. It was transforming itself under pressure, from outside, from within, from the ticking clock of oil prices and a restless youth. In this storm of change, the kingdom's skyline began to sprout new shapes. Futuristic towers, NEOM brochures promising a city in the desert lit like a science fiction film, promenades along the Red Sea designed for tourists who had never before been invited. Above it all, the same sun that had watched over Abdulaziz's first ride back to Riyadh now watched over a different kind of march, toward a future in which oil might matter less, image might matter more, and control would be exercised with tools that did not exist when the first Saudi state was born. The question that had shadowed every generation of the House of Saud remained, now sharper than ever. How long can a family rule a changing land, by changing faster than the land can break? The answer lay in the hands of the young prince who had seized the wheel, and in the hearts of millions of Saudis, whose lives were being rewritten by decisions made in palaces they would never see. The desert was no longer the only arena. Now there were global markets, social networks, public relations campaigns, surveillance systems. And somewhere between the glow of fireworks at a new concert and the darkness of a cell where a dissident sat alone, the true price of this new vision was being calculated. Visions of tomorrow, reform, repression, and the uncertain future. The kingdom awoke to neon. In Riyadh, the night sky, once defined by stars and the dim hum of traffic, now pulsed with electric blues, reds, and purples from massive billboards advertising new festivals, new dreams, new transformations. Fireworks burst over Boulevard Riyadh City. Music, once rare in public, thundered across open-air stages. Families strolled under bright screens showing advertisements for concerts, films, games, and international spectacles that would have been unimaginable a decade earlier. A young woman, wearing jeans beneath a modest coat, walked beside her brother, laughing as drones lit up the desert sky in organized constellations. A few meters away, a foreign tourist took photographs in awe, marveling at a country that had until recently been closed to him entirely. This was the new Saudi Arabia, reshaped under Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, known simply as MBS. To many Saudis, especially the young, it felt like a long-awaited breath after years of constraint. Cinemas reopened, women began to drive, concerts filled stadiums. The once rigid religious police saw their authority sharply limited. It was as if a kingdom wrapped in layers of tradition had suddenly torn those layers away, revealing a modern core ready to leap into the global spotlight. And yet beneath the glow, beneath the hum of music and construction cranes, shadows still moved, subtle and uneasy. Because every step forward in visibility came with a step inward in control. The vision takes shape. Vision 2030 became the mantra of the age. Sleek brochures, glossy videos, and global conferences presented a future of economic diversification, tech hubs, tourism megaprojects, and new cultural identities. The old dependence on oil, MBS declared, had reached its limit. "We must reinvent ourselves," he said in an interview broadcast around the world. "We will build a Saudi Arabia that can stand strong long after the last barrel of oil is sold." Across the kingdom, projects took shape that seemed almost mythic in scale. NEOM, a $500 billion megacity on the Red Sea, promised as a futuristic utopia where robots served humans, drones delivered goods, and artificial intelligence shaped daily life. The Line, a narrow, 170-kilometer-long vertical city slicing through the desert, built without cars or streets, powered entirely by renewable energy. Qiddiya, a massive entertainment city featuring theme parks, sports venues, and race tracks. Red Sea development, luxury resorts spread across pristine islands, marketed to global travelers. Construction sites buzzed with cranes. Promotional videos showed digital renderings of glass towers rising from empty sand. International investors flocked to conferences in Riyadh, seeking a piece of the new future. And young Saudis filled university halls, training for jobs their parents' generation could never have imagined. Software engineers, film directors, architects, cybersecurity experts, game developers. For them, the kingdom's transformation was more than policy. It was identity. "My mother never had these opportunities," one student said as she walked between modern lecture halls. "My daughter will have even more. That is what matters." Yet older Saudis sometimes watched in quiet confusion. "This is not the land I knew," an elderly shopkeeper in Buraydah murmured as he stood in front of a flashing music festival banner. "Maybe it is better, maybe it is worse, but it is fast, too fast." Speed was both the kingdom's new engine and its new risk. The iron in the vision. But while MBS opened doors for some, he closed them firmly on others. Within months of announcing bold reforms, the state moved decisively to consolidate control. Activists who had campaigned for years for women's right to drive were arrested, ironically, just as the ban was lifted. Some were accused of foreign ties, others simply of disturbing social stability. Their supporters whispered their names carefully, never sure who might be listening. Prominent clerics who opposed the new entertainment policies vanished into detention, accused of promoting extremism. Businessmen, including billionaires and princes, were detained in the now infamous Ritz-Carlton purge. Cameras caught limousines entering but not leaving. Some detainees were allegedly pressured into handing over portions of their wealth. Others negotiated quietly. All emerged changed. It was necessary, supporters said. It was a message, cynics said. It was fear, whispered critics in private. Meanwhile, a sprawling surveillance network expanded quietly behind the scenes. Digital monitoring systems capable of tracking social media posts, facial recognition at events, and new counterterrorism laws with wide definitions of threats. In a country where dissent had always been limited, the boundaries grew even tighter. But the paradox was this: the same government that jailed activists launched campaigns celebrating women's empowerment. The same leadership that restricted political speech invited international pop stars to perform. The same state that reigned in the religious police promoted a national identity rooted in Islam, but modernized. This duality, liberal on the surface, authoritarian beneath, became the defining rhythm of the new era. The murder that shook the world. Then, in 2018, a single event struck like lightning through global consciousness. A Saudi journalist named Jamal Khashoggi walked into the Saudi consulate in Istanbul to obtain paperwork for his upcoming marriage. He never walked out. International investigations soon claimed he had been killed inside the building by a team linked to Saudi intelligence. The world reeled as details emerged, details too dark, too brutal for many to believe. Western allies condemned the act. News anchors spoke in grave tones. Editorials questioned the kingdom's direction. Politicians called for sanctions. Human rights groups released report after report. In Riyadh, official statements denied any high-level order, insisting it had been a rogue operation. But the damage was done. For a moment, it looked as if the kingdom's grand projects, its investment conferences, its tourism campaigns, all of it, might collapse under global outrage. But oil still flowed. Strategic alliances still mattered. And the world, as it often does, moved on, slowly, awkwardly, reluctantly. Vision 2030 resumed its march. Yet something fundamental had shifted. Behind the fireworks and futuristic videos, a shadow now followed every mention of the new Saudi Arabia. The knowledge that the kingdom could display dazzling modernity with one hand, while tightening its grip with the other. The people between the lines. Inside the country, life transformed as dramatically as the skyline. Women filled roles once closed to them: security guards, pilots, bank managers, engineers. They drove down highways lit by LED street lamps, their hands tight on steering wheels once forbidden. Young men launched startups, coding late into the night in coffee shops that buzzed with ambition. Families went to movie theaters together for the first time in decades. Pop concerts sold out in minutes. Foreign tourists snapped selfies at ruins in Al-Ula, at Red Sea beaches, at glittering Riyadh districts. For many Saudis, the change brought pride, opportunity, and a sense that their country was finally stepping onto the global stage as more than an oil giant. But not everyone felt included. Some religious conservatives saw their world shrinking, the pillars of their authority weakened, the customs they grew up with fading. Some liberals saw the reforms as surface-level, social freedoms without political ones. Some Shia communities in the eastern province felt the grip of security and suspicion tighten rather than ease. And many ordinary Saudis, despite the excitement, struggled with rising living costs, unemployment, and a sense that the future was brighter in videos than in their wallets. The kingdom was no longer a quiet place of predictable rhythms. It was a place of acceleration, an airplane taking off so fast that not everyone had buckled their seatbelt. The future that flickers. In the high corridors of the royal court, advisors and ministers spoke the language of numbers. Diversification, gigaprojects, non-oil revenue, global partnerships, artificial intelligence, climate targets. But beneath the data lived deeper questions. What happens when a state built on religious legitimacy becomes the sponsor of massive entertainment festivals? What happens when a government that once banned cinemas now produces blockbuster films? What happens when a country where dissent is tightly controlled invites the world to come witness its new openness? The kingdom today stands at a crossroads that feels both thrilling and precarious. It is building the cities of tomorrow, while navigating the politics of yesterday. It is rewriting the identity of a nation, while ensuring that the pen never leaves the state's hand. It is empowering millions of young people, while reminding them that some doors remain locked. It is reaching for global influence, while guarding its internal unity with vigilance sharpened by history. In the desert north of Tabuk, construction lights glow through the night as machines carve the first lines of NEOM into the earth. Workers in hard hats move beneath a sky so clear it shows the entire arc of the Milky Way. One of them, a young Saudi engineer, pauses on a scaffold and looks at the vast empty land around him. "My grandfather herded goats," he says quietly. "I'm building a city from science fiction. This land changes faster than we do." His words drift into the wind, and the wind carries them across a kingdom whose story began in exile and sword, rose on oil and alliances, survived rebellions and wars, and now stands on the edge of a future no one fully understands. A future where neon lights and ancient mosques coexist, where reform and repression move arm in arm, where the House of Saud seeks to shape the 21st century as decisively as it shaped the 20th. Whether it succeeds, or whether the weight of old bargains and new expectations will pull the kingdom toward another reckoning, is a question that lingers like heat in the desert night. For now, the cranes keep rising. The music keeps echoing. The sand keeps shifting. And the story of Saudi Arabia, ever dramatic, ever conflicted, ever transforming, moves forward step by bold, uncertain step.